g'day mate, 40 here. What better way to start the show than taking a glance at Richard Spencer's Twitter feed. It says, why I began to hate Gab and have not posted there in years, that you are not just posting at Gab, you are joining Team Gab. You are endorsing Andrew Torber's cringe-inducing talking points, Bible-thumping patriotism. All we want are platforms that are useful and have clear guidelines. Tyrone Jackson tweets, how pathetic is it that self-proclaimed fascists are complaining of state overreaction to the insurrection that they said that they wanted. You got what you paid for, no refunds. And here's Mike Pompeo speaking to an American audience, which assumes that nothing's worse than anti-Semitism. He's trying to scare them off of ever being critical of Israel.
But I want to talk to you tonight about something that I'm very worried about. Indeed, I am deeply worried about an old threat that is reemerging to Israel and Jews all around the world, the threat of anti-Semitism. It's a cancer metastasizing in the Middle East, in Europe, and indeed, sadly, here in the United States as well. In Britain, the Labour Party's tolerance of anti-Semitism in its ranks is a national disgrace. And France's Jews are under attack. The incidence of anti-Semitic attacks in Germany is also on the rise. Indeed, hate crimes against Jews in this country have risen by 1/3 since 2017. We don't have to go far but to consider attacks on the Orthodox Jewish community in Crown Heights, Brooklyn over this past year. And none of us will ever forget the 11 Americans murdered while praying one Shabbat morning at the Tree of Life Synagogue. May their memories be a blessing to all of us. Every decent human being has the responsibility to fight anti-Semitism. It's an affront to religious liberty. It denies the rights of Jews to worship their God. It attacks what it means to be Jewish, ethnically and religiously.
Okay, let's have a look here at some of Richard's commentary. He says, Pompeo speaking to an American audience, which assumes that there's nothing worse than anti-Semitism. He's trying to scare them off of being critical of Israel. Problem is that Israel is very unpopular around the world. Insisting to people who are already anti-Zionist that they are, in fact, anti-Semitic will likely have unintended consequences. Interesting thought there from Richard. So I saw he also got into it with Darren Beatty. I'll go over that. Huey Long says, Ali Alexander was someone's patsy, was pulling the strings of Gays for Trump and Groyper Incorporated. Someone else, though, was funding Ali and distributing Bitcoin bags to all of these influencers who told their audience to go to D.C. So Ali Alexander worked closely with some fairly powerful people. Wow, this is a very long thread here. But from Quarantine Life, the insurrection on Capitol Hill. There are many players who participated and supported what occurred on January 6th at the U.S. State Capitol, but the two main players in this thread are Ali Alexander, formerly Ali Akbar, and Representative Paul Gosar, Republican from Arizona. Ali Alexander is a convicted felon and a lead organizer of Stop the Steal. Ali has been active, one of the most prominent voices over the last couple of years in promoting disinformation, organizing right-wing events, and supporting other right-wing icons. Representative Paul Gosar is a Republican representative from Arizona. He has spent the last year also promoting disinformation, aiding and spreading awareness of right-wing events, and supporting other right-wing icons. Ali Alexander has been very active on Twitter over the past few years, as is the representative. Ali Alexander directly implicated Representative Paul Gosar in one of his videos, saying, I was the person who came up with the January 6th idea while Congressman Gosar, we four, schemed up a maximum pressure on Congress while they were voting.
Maximum pressure. So I want to let you guys know how we're responding, because I was the person who came up with the January 6th idea with Congressman Gosar, Congressman Mo Brooks, and then Congressman Andy Biggs. We four schemed up of putting maximum pressure on Congress while they were voting so that who we couldn't lobby, we could change the hearts and the minds of Republicans who were in that body, hearing our loud war from outside. So I'm going to tell you this. This is my commitment to you. Any hotel that shuts down, me and my team at stopthesteal.us will find rooms for those people. Period. If you trusting. So
okay, here's the oddly suspicious timing of Representative Lauren Bobbitt's objections, Representative Paul Gosar's objections, and the breaching and evacuation of the U.S. state capitol. They all occurred within 25 minutes of each other. Paul Gosar was stopped mid-objection due to the House recess being called because of the insurrection and the subsequent evacuation.
The Secretary of State...
For 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, I filed my petition, a challenge on the slate of electors from the state of Arizona that was actually put forward by Governor Dorsey of Arizona. My ask to you, the Speaker, to the Vice President, is simple. Do not count these electors until and unless the Secretary of State allows a forensic audit of the election, a request she has denied repeatedly. We have been told over and over that even though this was a public election, using public money on public machines, utilizing public employees, the public today has no ability to simply double-check the veracity of these results. If the presidential election was a football game, we would get a slow-motion review from multiple angles and a correction of a controversial decision. But not so, we are told by our Secretary of State for the presidential election. No review for you. No access to the Dominion voting machines with a documented history of enabling fraud through its now discredited adjudication system, a system that literally allows one person to change tens of thousands of votes in a mere minutes. In the only audit done in Arizona, a court found 3% error rate against President Trump. Vice President Biden's margin of error was 1/10 of that, at 0.03%. By the way, a 3% error rate at minimum is 90,000 ballots. After finding the 3% error rate, the court stopped the audit and refused to go further. In Arizona, as my attachments make clear, mail-in ballots were altered on the first day of counting, as shown in data graphs we provide, and is concluded by data analysts. Over 400,000 mail-in ballots were altered, switched from President Trump to Vice President Biden, or completely erased from President Trump's totals. The proof is in the counting curves, the curves that cannot occur except with odds so rare and unlikely that winning the Mega Millions lottery is more probable. Mr. Speaker, can I have order in the chamber?
The House will be in order.
And that's when he was stopped due to the insurrection and evacuation. So Ali and Representative Gosar first connected on Twitter 9th of February 2020. Over the next year, their correspondence ramped up. Specific importance was the post-election period. Here's an image of Gosar sparring with AOC, tagging Ali and Stop the Steal on the 6th of November, and an image of Gosar congratulating Ali Alexander, formerly Ali Akbar, on his work on the 15th of November 2020. On the 19th of December, Ali attended a pro-Trump rally at Arizona State Capitol promoting Stop the Steal, and went on to use "yet" as a code word for violence. Stop the Steal organizer Ali Alexander said his group wasn't violent yet. We're nice patriots. We don't throw bricks. I leaned over and I said, not yet, not yet. Haven't you read about a little tar and feathering? Those were second-degree burns. 22nd of December, Ali Akbar tweeted this image where he was hoping this call changed the world. He was talking to GOP Congressman Representative Gosar, Representative Mo Brooks, and Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona. 25th of December, Ali posted, "This is the last stop before civil war." During this mid to late December period, Representative Paul Gosar was also promoting Stop the Steal. Late December, early January, Ali Alexander had been traveling around the country riling up the crowds at Stop the Steal rallies. This rally, the video starts with Ali Alexander saying 1776 is always an option. leads to the crowd chanting 1776.
1776!
76 is always an option. 1776! 1776! 1776! 1776! 1776! 1776! We know our rights come from God and not government. That Jesus Christ endowed us with Christian liberty. That Christians reformed the Roman Empire and civilized the barbaric world, didn't we? We united all races and all religion under a creed of we the people. And we're going to do it again. So I want to end with this, just a clerical point.
Jesus is king!
Christ is king!
Christ is king!
Christ is king! Christ is king!
Christ is king! Christ is king! Christ is king! Christ is king!
I'll end with two more points because I don't want to filibuster, and I'm going to promise you this. I will be with y'all until the last person leaves here, because this is family. I gave up my Thanksgiving to march against the lockdowns in Chicago with Michael Coutroy. I will give up my Christmas.
Okay, so this illustrates that Christianity, along with Judaism, are infinitely flexible with regard to politics. So you can chant Christ is king and embrace nonviolence. You can chant Christ is king and embrace violence. There's no particular politics that accompanies Christ is king. Okay, here's what Ali was saying on the days leading up to the insurrection. I believe insurrection is a vast overstatement. It was a temporary sit-in. DC becomes Fort Trump starting tomorrow on my orders. I intend to keep our republic at any cost. Join us. We are peaceful 1776 protesters. Note the 1776 revolutionary symbolism. On the 5th of January, Paul Gosar quote tweeted Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona, tweeted about January 6th Trump rally, called for others to fight for Trump and to hold the line. January 6th, he welcomed the Patriots. On January 6th, the day of the Capitol Hill riot, Ali Alexander tweeted first official day of the rebellion. January 6th, Ali Alexander, Paul Gosar both got their talking points and tweeted Antifa agitation, all Antifa. Matt Gaetz, who was also seen calmly on his phone, not interested in his gas mask, also claimed it was Antifa without any proof just after the House resumed. So let's play.
Compelling evidence from a facial recognition company showing that some of the people who breached the Capitol today were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters and, in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa. Now, we should seek to build America up, not tear her down and destroy her. And I am sure glad that at least for one day, I didn't hear my Democrat colleagues calling to defund the police.
January 7th, Representative Paul Gosar agreed with the coup, saying, "This is on you. The people demand transparency." January 7th, he also tweeted, "Biden should concede. I want his concession on my desk tomorrow morning. Don't make me come over there." Notice how Ali Alexander was linked to this tweet with Ali next to Stop the Steal 2021. January 7th, he also tweeted a video of his potential co-conspirator Mo Brooks saying, "Great job, brother." He also tweeted, "A million voices demand justice. Not even Biden thinks he won." On 24th of November 2020, Representative Paul Gosar tweeted this reference, linking Trump supporters to Japanese soldiers who keep on fighting for decades after the Japanese had surrendered. Ali Alexander is linked in this tweet. On January 6th, Ali released a statement stating, "I don't disavow, I do not denounce this. Stop the Steal is going to be the home of the rebellion against the government." He knew exactly what was happening.
What I've warned about. Look at this. And it's replicated on the other side. This is we the people. The growing frustrations of the government and what's happening now is exactly what I've warned about. I've said that we need to make fair elections and transparent counting so that the people do not feel like the last resort is public demonstrations like this. Now, I want to say something. I don't disavow this. I do not denounce this. This is completely peaceful, looks like so far. and there are a couple of agitators that I obviously don't endorse, but this is completely peaceful. This is we the people, and this will only grow when our government and our media and the banks tell us to shut up and sit down, and that we can't investigate anything, we can't get to conclusions on anything, that we're locked in these tight bureaucratic deadlines that usher us to the next point to, whatever. So stopthesteal.us is going to be the home of the rebellion against an illegitimate government. Make the process fair.
Hey, January 5 at the pro-Trump pre-DC rally. Evening before the insurrection of the U.S. state capitol, Ali yelled to the crowd, "Victory or death," to which the crowd chants along. He then declares, "We're starting a rebellion against the deep state."
Victory or death! Victory or death! Victory! I had one friend. Victory or death!
Okay, so not just 3 GOP congressmen were conspiring with Ali Alexander, appears to be the whole of the Arizona GOP. They have appeared to scrub most references to Ali on their Twitter pages. Appears that the link between the Arizona GOP and Ali Alexander Stop the Steal is connected all the way down to its most fundamental levels. Ali Alexander claims that up to 50 Arizona GOP are involved in Stop the Steal in some way.
But what I will tell you is that, Arizona started with one man, State Representative Mark Fincham, and he's become a great friend and a brother to me, and he will be running for higher office there in Arizona. But, when we had that Arizona hearing, we then had 9. And then after the Arizona hearing was concluded, it was 11 and a half hours long. Our private whip count was about 13 or 14. Now we're dealing with about 40 or 50 of them in Arizona. So I'm very optimistic that Stop the Steal has already taken over Arizona, that we will control who the leadership is in the state houses, and we will toss out Doug Ducey.
So Ali Alexander worked closely with powerful, influential dark money groups like the Council for National Policy, Roger Stone, Mike Flynn, Steve Bannon to rapidly explode into all 50 states within days of reviving Stop the Steal. It was a coordinated op.
And November 4th, I got a text message from my friend Scott Pressler, who's one of the best activists on either side of the aisle, and does these trash pickups and voter registrations, a real salt of the earth type of guy. He texted me, he said, "Ali, I've got airline miles, I'm willing to do whatever needs to be done, I just need a little direction." And I went to brunch and chose that I wasn't going to text him back. The country had been lost, and I could survive in a society that was ran by Democrats. But at brunch, I had 2 fellows that I helped mentor, and one of them said, "If you could help save the world, and if you could help save the world and you won't, what does that mean?" or something like that. And I said, dang it.
That's a good point.
Dang it. And so we went home and we started Stop the Steal, and we married GOP local activists with social media influencers to start the protest. That first night we were in 2 or 3 states. The next night we were in 5 states. On Friday, I think we were in 6 states. And on Saturday, we had Stop the Steal Saturday. We were in all 50 states. And the country's never seen anything like it.
Right. So Glib Medley says in the chat that Ali Alexander is this generation's Dinesh D'Souza.
A violent takeover of the Capitol to overturn the presidential election. White power, Trump troops, and at the center of it, this man, Ali Alexander.
No! We'll light the whole shit on fire.
Before the Washington riot, he was in Georgia creating mayhem with Alex Jones to overturn the presidential election.
And make no mistake, this is the globalist takeover. Either they see Trump, prove that they won, or they're not going to hand them back the country in January, right? No! We'll light the whole shit on fire.
And who was Alexander working with?
USA! USA!
The Georgia Republican Party and the National Republican Senatorial Committee. That's right, Ali Alexander, hate monger, convicted felon. And here he is yucking it up with a Nazi. the official partner of the Georgia Republican Party, working with the GOP to lead a door-knocking operation in Georgia. And here's Alexander in Washington.
And what's happening now is exactly what I've warned about.
We call the Republican Party.
Please leave a message at the tone.
Hello, this is Greg Palast of the Pacifica Network, and I'm calling to find out why the Republican Senatorial Committee is working with someone named Ali Alexander in Georgia. Before the DC riots, he was there, said, "We'll light the whole shit on fire." I want to know why you are working with him. Please call me. We never got an answer.
Okay, Representative Paul Gosar's brother Tim claims that Representative Paul Gosar was an organizer and a mastermind of the plot to do what was done last week, and that he committed treason and insurrection.
What do you think should happen now after the invasion of the Capitol?
Well, I think what's happened when you're an organizer, when you're a mastermind of a plot to do what was done last week, you're just as guilty as the mob that you besieged and took and overran the House. And so when that's the case, you're just as guilty as the events and the people and what they did and the 5 people that lost their lives. So there's blood on your hands. I would say too, Lawrence, that Paul swore an oath to support, defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When you take that oath and you commit treason and insurrection, aren't you the person that has committed those crimes? And aren't you the enemy that you're sworn to protect us from?
So you want your brother expelled?
Absolutely.
Okay. And looking at Richard's Twitter feed, he retweets a comment, "Trump isn't as big as you thought he was. He just stood in front of a setting sun and cast a long shadow. We are all in twilight together now. Don't let your fire go out. It's about to get very dark. The election was not rigged. The election was not stolen. Trump lied about all of that. Anyone who cannot explicitly state those 3 facts and believe it is politically useless." Richard notes, Ali Alexander adopted the goofy Christianity of the American right, but transformed it into a kind of radical Islam. He literally claims that God will seek vengeance and Ali will be his sword. Allahu Akbar indeed. And Richard wonders where. I don't think Nick Fuentes' audience would have accepted him dumping Trump or even strongly criticizing him. So in a way, going to the mat for Trump was necessary and inevitable. And regarding Fuentes, Richard says there was no there outside of a few racist and edgy opinions. If they went rogue, meaning the alt-right, who were they then? What did they believe in? They only really believed in Trump and owning the libs. They're essentially just racist conservatives. Nick was a little bit of both. He was a good talker, clearly imitated right-wing radio personalities like Rush. He also reflected his audience. When they supported him, they felt like they were supporting themselves. There are also reflectors who are basically exactly on the level of their audience. Tim Pool is an excellent example. So on the right, there are entertainers and reflectors. Entertainers are wild, boisterous personalities like Alex Jones and Steven Crowder. They are bigger than their audience. And then there are reflectors like Nick Fuentes and Tim Pool, who simply reflect their audience, feed back to their audience what they want to hear. Now, Mark Brahmin tweets, one of the highest Roman virtues was gravitas, roughly seriousness. It was something almost totally absent in the online culture of the distant right and the in-real-life movements that sprang from it. So who the heck is Mark Brahmin? I know he does a bunch of podcasts with Richard Spencer. I've never gotten much out of Mark's contributions, so I Googled his name, came up with some article here from Pharos, Pharos, doing justice to the classics. So talks about January 2019, Radix Journal published an article about the Saturnalian ancient Roman festival. It is popularly but probably erroneously believed to be the origin of Christmas. The article entitled Christmas, the Saturnalia and the Jewish Saturn makes the anti-Semitic argument that the Roman festival and Christmas itself commemorates a prehistoric time when Jews or proto-Jews ruled before the restoration of an Aryan hegemony. So I probably listened to 3 hours of Mark Brahmin in my life, and he just rarely makes much sense to me. The article's author is Mark Brahmin, so I try to figure out, like, who is this guy who doesn't make any sense? Like, why does he not make sense? His poetry appears on Stormfront, and he produced a video for Richard Spencer entitled Commercial for Fascism. His main interests are evident on his website, the Apollonian Transmission, which aims to prove the existence of a coherent, decipherable symbol language applied by Jewish esotericists against racial and sexual competitors. So sometimes people can get so carried away by their hatred for a particular group that they lose sense. So his analysis of Saturnalia is an example of his method, which is esoteric in that it attempts to reveal in European mythologies a hidden or symbolic narrative of Aryan ascendancy and so prove the superiority of the Aryan race. Underpinning Mark Brahmin's analysis is a claim that in Roman mythology, the god Saturn represents the Jewish people and Jupiter represents Aryans. He bases this claim about Saturn on a passage in the Roman historian Tacitus's Histories. The passage says that Jews said to have been refugees from the island of Crete, who settled in the remotest corner of Libya in the days when, according to the story, Saturn was driven from his throne by the aggression of Jupiter. So this is like, why would anyone accord any significance to this statement by Tacitus? So Tacitus is referring to the Roman mythological story that Saturn was said to have presided over a golden age, and Tacitus's claims are the key to everything Brahmin says. Tacitus's claims are almost certainly wrong. There were certainly Jewish people in Crete in ancient times, but Tacitus is the only ancient writer to claim that they lived there. Standard commentary on this passage of Tacitus says it falls sadly below Tacitus' usual standard as a historian, not so much for his anti-Semitism, which was widespread in ancient writers, but for the general ignorance and silliness displayed. So Tacitus' evident preference for absurdities over information that was widely available. The Tacitus invented a connection between Jews and Saturn to create an explanation for the coincidence that the Jewish Sabbath took place on the day of the week that in Roman culture was named after Saturn, our Saturday. So Mark Brahmin generally just seems silly. It just seems like a waste of time, the time that I've spent listening to him. Richard Spencer notes, it's curious that Scott Greer and Patrick Casey weren't present at the Stop the Steal rally in D.C. January 6th. They attended most rallies leading up to January 6th alongside Nick Fuentes. Milo Yiannopoulos claimed to have been tipped off beforehand. And here's Richard saying, this is unambiguously a crime, talking about Nick Fuentes here. At the very least, Fuentes is disrupting government activity. That's a charitable reading. The whole event has been declared an insurrection by prosecutors. They will treat it as such. I think that's a dramatic overstatement. Seems to me much more like a sit-in.
We have just learned that they have stopped the vote of the Electoral College in Congress. I say that we should not leave this Capitol until Donald Trump is inaugurated president. We, the American people, will not let this fraudulent election go forward one more step. Because the truth is that Donald Trump won the
So apparently Vincent James and the Red Elephants have been banned from Dlive.
election on November 3rd by a landslide, and we will accept nothing less than 4 more years of President Donald Trump. 4 more years, 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 4 more years. And we are going to put Donald Trump back in office so that complete the southern border wall. And we're going to get Donald Trump in office for 4 more years so that he can take every last illegal alien and throw them back over the border. We are going to put Trump in office for 4 more years so that we can finally free ourselves from the parasitic global special interests that have taken over this country. Because what you see in this Capitol at the Million MAGA March or the second Million MAGA March or what you're seeing right here today is the American people rising up. Where's Thomas?
Okay, I think to call that insurrection or criminal speech is a reach. Richard tweets, Fuentes was referencing stopping the vote and directly urging on and celebrating those entering the U.S. Capitol. If you're a dissident, you need to learn a lesson. Major Republican figures and conservative grifters wanted to stop the vote or at least make a spectacular display. They needed some loons to do the dirty work and take the real risks. Hope that some consideration will be shown to Fuentes, being that he's young and clearly acting at the will of others. He was trusting the plan, and that will always get you burned. According to Nick Fuentes, they only plan to enter the Capitol, ironically. And Richard says, Tucker's analysis here is wrong. Trump and Trump voters fully mobilized cannot win a national election. Two, the overwhelming majority of them won't leave the GOP plantation over Mitch McConnell's machinations.
Apparently it is hard, because for the last week, slow learners like Mitch McConnell have missed it completely. They've allowed themselves instead to be led into rhetorical cul-de-sacs on the question of Donald Trump's personal character as a man. At no point does it seem to have occurred to McConnell or any of these sort of geniuses clustered around him that what is really at stake right now is not the future of Donald Trump. He's elderly and retiring next week, but instead the future of his voters, tens of millions of them, American citizens who in the space of the last 7 days have seen themselves redefined as domestic terrorists. Apparently it is hard, because for the last week, slow learners like
Vincent James has been banned from Dlive. Let's get some of his comments here.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. We had a little bit of a hiccup, and now we are continuing live here on, what is this site called? Trovo.net. What is this website called? What are we on? Trovo.live/Vincent James. How's the stream working? How is the stream working? Someone says this is terrible. KGB says this is terrible. It doesn't look like it's buffering at all. It looks like it's handling it fairly well. We only have about 500 or so viewers here, so we'll see. But I've sort of strolled through this website and perused some of the people that are live streaming here, and a couple of people have like 1,000 live viewers or a couple of thousand live viewers or something like that, and it seems to handle pretty well. It doesn't look like it's buffering for me. It looks like the stream is working very well. 720p, no problem. Okay, well, that's good. That is good. So we'll be here for the time being. It seems like this is going to be a safe place for the time being, temporarily, until we can work a few things out. We're going to be talking about that. We're going to be talking about my Dlive ban. So as most of you already probably know, if not all of you already probably know that are watching right now, I was permanently banned from Dlive on Monday. So I did a stream, I believe it was on Monday. Yeah, it was on Monday. I did a stream on Monday, and directly after I finished the stream, I got an email in my inbox on my Gmail account. It said, your Dlive account has been permanently suspended for violating the terms of service. And of course, I didn't violate any of the terms of service. I have never called for violence. I've been very optical. I've been very careful and strategic about what I say on my show. I've learned the hard way early on. I think a lot of you, if you've been following me for quite some time, you probably remember. I learned the hard way, and I've always been sort of prudent, I guess you can say. I've always been sort of careful with my language on video, because I always knew that the internet is obviously forever, and if they're going to use a clip of you saying something to destroy you, destroy your character, destroy your life, destroy your livelihood, they're going to do that. And so I've always been very careful of what I say, especially when my face is on screen. There's been a few hiccups, of course, over the past couple of years, but of course I didn't break any of their terms of service, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter. Dlive was pressured by the mainstream media in a coordinated attack, and they caved. As most of you also already probably know, Nick Fuentes was banned from Dlive a day before I was banned from Dlive. Then after I was banned from Dlive, Ethan Ralph of the Ralph Retort was banned from Dlive, although he was...
Okay, so this is where historicism's important. So we could all say that we stand for various transcendent ideals. We can all say we stand for free speech. But when contexts change, when the situation changes, then your reactions are going to change. So Dlive was pretty laissez-faire, easygoing, libertarian about content. And then this disaster on Capitol Hill changed. Dlive started getting slammed in the mainstream media. So it's helpful to think of morality as not just transcendent and not just as absolute, but it is transcendent, absolute, and also situational. The situation determines the moral absolute. So Dlive comes under pressure, and so they're going to change accordingly. The terms of service for Dlive and YouTube, there's no real difference as far as freedom of speech. It's just that until now, Dlive, generally speaking, has been much less censorious in practice.
He was banned. I think he got a 30-day ban, but I don't know, if they're actually going to allow him to stream on the platform again. After 30 days, it'll probably turn into a permanent ban, and then hopefully the rest of the people that are still on Dlive right now can stay there. But we hope that is the case, but we never know. And so now we're here on Trovo.live. And I put out a statement on Telegram after my Dlive ban, and I basically said, this is no shock to me. I mean, I've been dealing with this for years and years and years now, ever since I started my show 4 or 5 years ago on the side, outside of the job that I had when I was working for that ad agency. And I worked for that ad agency for about 13 years or so, and I was one of the better sales reps there. And one day, there were a few articles that were passed around the office, of course, outright slander by journalists who absolutely hated the fact that I had the ability to go on Facebook, to go on YouTube, and break down a certain event, or break down a certain protest, or break down a certain rally, and tell the truth about actually what happened at that rally, and have it get millions upon millions upon millions of views. The first nemesis, I guess you can say, that I had in the mainstream media was OC Weekly, and it's this local paper. For those who live in Orange County, you probably know. It's a very popular paper.
Okay, so no introspection here from Vince that he may possibly have gone wrong, that he may have possibly put a foot wrong, that he may have said some things that were ill-advised. There's no introspection here that he may have a part to play in his own misery. So when I hear people speaking as though they have absolutely nothing to do with their own misery, I become skeptical.
And these journalists at OC Weekly didn't like the fact that I had that ability to reach many millions more people than they were able to reach with their shitty paper. And so they came after me for me telling the truth about what occurred at certain protests, particularly one in Huntington Beach. And they wrote this article, Alt-Right Collective, Orange County's Alt-Right Collective or media entity or something like this. And this article gets passed around my office, and I get called into the Human Resources Department, and I got axed from my job. And ever since then, my name is out there in the mainstream media, alt-right, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, all of these libelous, slanderous labels that are absolutely untrue. But it doesn't matter if they're untrue.
Well, did they do anything that may have contributed to that perception? So I'm a little skeptical of his claims of 100% innocence. Right, this is a
guy
clip
who's
from
absolutely
last
desperate
year.
to keep his accounts, and that's all that matters to him now. He is going to do whatever he needs to do, and what he needs to do at this current point in time, more than anything, is to virtually...
Okay, so this is Sargon of Akkad calling Nick Fuentes apparently a white supremacist. Let's slow it down a little bit.
You signal to the establishment and say to them, please, 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 just give me more time. Please don't take me down as well. And that's what he's saying, isn't it? That is
how pathetic, though, Mark. How pathetic. He knows people are coming for Fuentes. Go ahead.
The terms, and I find this so tiresome. The fact that he's still using the establishment's terminology to condemn.
Okay, so this is Mark Collette commenting on Sargon of Akkad.
People who are nominally on his side of the political fence is tiresome beyond belief. To call people at a time like this Nazis, white supremacists, that is just emboldening people like Pelosi, the Democrats, Antifa. You are using their rhetoric. What is happening now is a full communist takeover of the United States. And ironically, the communist takeover is being facilitated by the capitalist corporate machinery. Now, at a point like this, when we are facing such a complete and utter tyranny, you'd think Sargon would be more worried about the deplatformings, the tyranny, the loss of freedom of speech, but he's not. He's still virtue signaling to his enemies that he's this guy on the fence and will criticize both sides. It is pitiful. It is weak. He should be treated with contempt, but he won't be. Do you know why he won't be? Because he has a huge audience full of people like him who want to sit on that ever-thinning fence because they too don't want to get into trouble with mummy and daddy. And those people, they may be the last to go, but they'll still end up in the...
They will still go. You will still go one way or the other, and you're going to be... Man, just how can you live your life as such a cuck? So pathetic. Nick Fuentes, they're not big buddies or whatever, but I think they participated in a tag team debate and, or at least friendly-ish to each other. Why would you, on a day where people are coming for Fuentes, they're trying to shut him down, this is a colleague of yours. Even all that we've been through and talk shit to each other, even Sargon of Akkad, a colleague. Why, at this consequential just hinge of history, Mr. Collett, this is a very important time right now, and to just go out of your way to, this white supremacist Fuentes, how pathetic, and just how cowardly, and just what a craven maneuver. This is
what he's always done. This is him down to a T. It's everything that his career is built on. It's built on sitting on the fence.
Okay, could there possibly be good reasons why someone who's within the Overton window, such as Sargon of Akkad, may want to distance himself from people like Nick Fuentes?
It's built on bringing up red herrings to discredit any form of actual resistance to the system, so he can sit there smugly claiming that he's taken neither side, that he's always been the guy who's taken the high road. It's
Okay, a lot of complaining there. Let's have a look back on Richard Spencer's Twitter feed. While the failures of Trump and Brexit have demoralized many self-described nationalists, some are now realizing that national populism was just a phase and that the true collective identity of the future will emerge through an upgrade to civilizational consciousness. That's perhaps a better term these days than ethno-nationalism. Call it civilizational consciousness. Okay, so Richard's been getting into it with Darren Beatty. Let's have a look at one of them. Okay, so Richard says, Darren, due to your record, no serious person will ever take you seriously. So you are left with the applause of Cassandra Fairbanks, some job which will be taken away from you promoting Holocaust education in Europe and constantly yammering about educational credentials. Everyone except Donald Trump, Darren Beatty, and the editorial staff of Revolver, maybe Gateway Pundit, is an unbearable moron. Couldn't get into an Ivy League or Ivy peer school and has an IQ between 95 and 105 who can't read Hegel, according to Darren Beatty. This is Richard translating Darren Beatty. You've lost touch with reality, Darren. So in this battle between Darren and Richard, I think Richard gets the better of it. Now, I think both Darren and Richard are romantics, meaning they frequently see far more in reality than is really there. So both highly intelligent, both, far more intelligent than I am, both often interesting, but both liable to the weaknesses of romanticism, which is in some seeing more in reality than is really there. Richard says about Darren, for months, you contributed to ideas and information with your obviously incorrect nonsense about a coming color revolution and a stolen landslide election. Either you are smart and immoral and you consciously lied, or you're unhinged and dumb. Which one is it? I think Darren got disconnected from reality. So both Richard and Darren, when things go well or when they get certain perhaps hormonal swells in their system, that they become very liable to lose touch with reality. But Richard has an awesome Twitter feed. And Darren frequently does too. It's they're equal parts of interesting and frequently unhinged. It's really not that big of a deal that you got into Duke graduate school, says Richard, just saying, because Richard also went to Duke. And Darren responds, I'm flattered by your resentment, Richard, but I'm not letting you take Jonah Goldberg's place in scrubbing my feet with your joke master's degrees. So I think that's a very weak put down. I think Richard definitely gets the best of this scrap. No one is scrubbing your feet, Darren. You live in a fantasy world. Well, both Darren and Richard frequently do live in fantasy worlds. It makes them interesting. It makes them irresponsible. Sometimes the irresponsibility outweighs whatever interest that they convey. In the real world, you made terrible calculations. You willfully involved yourself in information and idea pollution, and you continue to double down. No one resents your contempt is closer to the mark. I think Richard is making very sharp points there. Darren responds, when you look up, clenching your joke maps degree, you see my face looking down on you. Richard responds, you're channeling Rorschach, pretty telling. No one looks up to you, Darren. Okay. Let's pull things together. Let's move things onto a higher plane. Let's learn about the Sea of Fate.
The Red Sea waters are parted by Moses, and the pursuing Egyptian commander is dumbfounded. All this century, we've been getting our idea of what the Bible is about, as much from the cinema as from reading the Bible itself. And Hollywood convention decrees that the great miracles and supernatural deliverances of the Bible shall be filmed literally, just as the book says.
This is from the BBC back in 1984.
The trouble is that we in the audience know as well as the filmmakers that this can only be done by special effects. The result is to make the Bible seem like fantasy or science fiction. The more innocently literal-minded you are, the more you expose the gap between the world of the Bible and ourselves. Does religious faith really depend on the belief that once upon a time things like this did actually happen? Or has there been a misunderstanding somewhere? The Bible, like all other scriptures, is a product of history. After 1000 BC, individual prophets and teachers who emerged from the desert with a new message of salvation could make it permanent in writing. When writing was first invented in the Middle East, it was used only for rather humdrum purposes like recording business deals. But in time, writing became so powerful that it could capture the message and even the personality of a great teacher. This was the biggest event in the history of religion so far. All the world faiths became popular and scriptural. They're mass movements of millions of people who are united around the person of the founder and who follow his path because they're able to commune with him through the Holy Book.
Okay, so if you want to start a live stream, I would bless you to find someone like Ricardo. He has been the pillar upon which I've built my live streams, and constantly provocative, and he has an emotional honesty that I tend to lack. I'm much more buttoned down and separated from my emotions than Ricardo, and so he's got a good challenge here. Remember when Luke loved Richard Spencer, then he turned on Richard Spencer, then he mocked Richard Spencer, now he loves Richard Spencer. Well, guess what? There are things about Richard Spencer from certain perspectives that are lovable. There are things about Richard Spencer or anyone. There are things about Ricardo or Richard or Luke that are lovable. There are things about all of us that are admirable. There are things about all of us that are well worthy of mockery. There are things about all of us that are well worthy of hatred. And so welcome to the human condition, Ricardo, Richard, Luke, right? We all have things that we say and do that are worthy of love. We all have things that we say and do that are worthy of mockery. We all have things that we say and do that are worthy of contempt. We all have things to say and do that are worthy of laughter. So one thing that is consistent is that Richard is good content. One thing about Ricardo, whether I love him or hate him, he is consistently good content. He has a visceral feel for the mediums of talk radio or live streaming that is far more attuned than mine. So people aren't just great or bad or stupid or contemptible or admirable. People are a mixture. Ponius notes that Richard Spencer is harmless now, so there is that. So yeah, some people become a lot better when they're humbled. So I have a personality tendency where I can become quite abusive. But do I start out just abusing the dickens out of people? No, I don't start abusing the dickens out of people. I start out, I think, generally polite. And then I just instinctively get a sense of what I can get away with. And then I slowly start breaking people down. I don't just like go, straight to breaking them down. I start real nice, and then I have a tendency to just see what I can get away with. And when people let me get away with bad behavior, do I go, oh, I got away with so much bad behavior with that person, now I'm going to clean up my act? No, I've long had a tendency. I hope that this tendency is attenuated now. I hope it's reduced by now. But I do have a tendency to take advantage, to abuse, to degrade. I wish I didn't. I wish I was a saint. I wish that I only wanted to uplift people. I wish that I only wanted to embody God and love in the world. I wish that I didn't have a cruel streak. I wish that I didn't have a streak that enjoyed degrading, provoking people. But unfortunately, I've got a dark side. And here's what happens. If someone lets me get away with mocking them, I keep mocking them. And then eventually the mocking becomes so degrading that usually people start setting limits with me. And when someone calls me on my bad behavior, I usually like snap back and go, oh, sorry. And I become perfectly polite again. And then I start gingerly edging back towards, taking advantage of them, mocking them, degrading them, beating them down. And then if they call me on it, then I immediately reset to being a polite, decent citizen. But if someone doesn't call me on it, like I had one girlfriend, I think the only girlfriend that I remember that I would yell at, because she never called me on it. I don't know what it was about the dynamic, but I just got into sort of relationship where I yelled at her quite a bit. Not real proud of that, but that was the dynamic. And then I'm thinking about other like male acquaintances I have where I feel like my patience is very, very meager. And I'm just about to yell at them. Like every time I interact with them, if it doesn't go exactly the way I want, I'm just about to yell at them. Now, why am I just about to yell at them? Because I've been able to get away with that. Right? If they called me on the abusive behavior, I'd probably back off. But we educate people on how they should treat us. Yeah, Ricardo is the pillar that this show is built on. Lipped is the pillar of the chat. Lipped is the true soul of the stream. Yeah, people are multifaceted. That's what Luke did to Babs yesterday. 5D just destroyed the kid. God forbid, God forbid. Luke is fascinated by Richard Spencer. I don't know if I'm fascinated. He has some interesting content, and he's an interesting character. And you need content, you need people, you need things where you see the ball clearly, right? Supposedly the most difficult thing in sports is to hit the curveball, right? And the river of information, of news that just flows over one who's doing a fairly topical news-based show is overwhelming. And 99.9% of news stories, I just don't have any comment on. But for whatever reason, when Richard Spencer throws out a pitch, it doesn't look like a normal baseball. Usually to me, it looks like a basketball. Like I can take that pitch and I can hit it, right? Normally it's really hard to hit a major league curveball. But for whatever reason, when Richard Spencer speaks, Richard Spencer tweets, I find it really easy to analyze what's going on and say something that's useful. Other people are much more opaque. They're more difficult to analyze. Or with the Nick Fuentes, that Richard's analysis is there's no there. There's not as much intellectual substance with Nick. He's much more of an entertainer. So I don't really have much to say about Nick Fuentes. But I'm looking, when you do a stream, the easiest thing to do is a reaction stream. You're looking for something to tee off on, to smack around, to get angry about, or to laugh about, or to make some sort of commentary. All right, I just can't sit here and just solely play the content of other people, believe it or not. So ideally, I want to react to other people's content. And for whatever reason, Richard's content is probably easier for me to react to than anyone else of which I'm aware, because I feel like I've kind of got a measure of the guy, and I got a sense of where he's coming from. And I think that I have something interesting and useful to say. I don't feel like I have much to say about Baked Alaska. I don't feel like I have much to say about Nick Fuentes. I don't think I have much to add to Jared Taylor. It's just that Richard is easy content. He's easy to respond to, and you need those old standbys that you can always go back to, and you know that you're going to have a high likelihood of having some sort of reaction. Okay, so I just found this house, Father of Unbelief, an intellectual biography. So David Friedrich Strauss lived in the 19th century, lived from 1808 to 1874, and he published the most scandalous, shocking book in German of the 19th century. It was called The Life of Jesus, A Critical Examination. So David Friedrich Strauss, according to this new book, is the father of modern unbelief in Germany. He was the leader of a whole parade of 19th century German intellectuals, from Feuerbach, Stirner, Marx, Schopenhauer, von Hartmann, Buchner, Haeckel, and Friedrich Nietzsche, who all attacked the authority of revealed religion and Orthodox Christianity. That's small o Orthodox, not the Eastern European variety. So this is a book that's just come out a few months ago, David Friedrich Strauss, Father of Unbelief, an intellectual biography. So his work in 1835, Life of Jesus Critical Examination, was the first major source for the loss of faith in Christianity in Germany. It was the most scandalous publication in Germany during his time. His book was a critique of the claims to historical truth of the New Testament, which had been the mainstay of Protestantism since the 16th century Reformation. As the father of unbelief, his critique of Christianity preceded that of Nietzsche. It preceded that of Marx and Feuerbach and Schopenhauer. They all built upon his critique. Now, his views imposed a harsh fate upon him, and this is why I'm somewhat attracted to this story, because some parts of me feel quite a lot of empathy with this. So his views imposed a harsh fate upon him. He was persecuted for his beliefs by religious and political authorities. He was denied employment in the university and government, forcing him to live as a freelance live streamer, as a freelance writer. He led a wandering and isolated life as an outcast. Talking here, David Friedrich Strauss. He was a philosopher, a theologian, and a Bible critic. And his legacy remains troubling for Christianity. His objections against the historical credibility of the New Testament remain as challenging today as they were nearly 2 centuries ago. Now, he was very much a figure of his age, and he seems no more relevant today than the neo-Hegelian movement to which he once belonged. So there are 3 major types of Hegelian philosophies with regard to Christianity. There's the right-wing type, which says that all of Christianity fits within the rubric of sound philosophy. There's the moderate Hegelianism, which says parts of Christianity are philosophically respectable. And then there's left-wing Hegelianism, which says that no part of Christianity is philosophically respectable.
Another person, David Friedrich Strauss, who lived from 1808 to 1874. Interesting, because Strauss, as part of this whole skepticism of the Enlightenment, is going to start looking at the Synoptic Gospels. Which are the Synoptic Gospels? Would that be John? You know, Synoptic Gospels are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he's going to start seeing the discrepancies in the Synoptic Gospels. You mean these 3 Gospels are not all the same? No. He's going to start taking a look at the differences in all those Gospels. Whoa, how is it that the Gospel of Mark doesn't talk about Jesus' birth? The Gospel of Matthew talks about Jesus' birth, and the Gospel of Luke gives us a whole different story of Jesus' birth. What do you do with that? Now that we have skeptics as a result of the Enlightenment, you know, the Bible is becoming more accessible to all. Remember how it was that with the invention of the printing press in the 15th century, suddenly it wasn't Father Jamie with the only Bible in the room. We could print a Bible so anyone in this room wanted a Bible, we could get you a Bible in your hands. You could start reading and saying, wait a minute, I thought I read something different. There's something different in Matthew from Luke. So Strauss started pointing to the discrepancies in the Synoptic Gospels. His conclusion were that the Gospels are not a book of history, but are faith stories. It's ultimately the story of this Christ of the faith. As a result of the faith that these people have, how are they interpreting Jesus? Strauss was influenced by Hegel. So stepping back, what did Hegel believe? Hegel believed that the mind worked by formulating a thesis, and then an antithesis, and then somewhere in the middle it'll arrive at a synthesis. Interesting. Sort of with this, for instance, the thesis, we might start off as a, as a young person believing everything that we're told, having lots of faith.
So that's sort of how I approach life, with my ideological enthusiasm. So I'm a bit of an ideological dilettante, or an intellectual of easy virtue, because I keep falling in love with every beautiful idea that comes along, and then, ultimately staying loyal to none of them. So what usually happens to me is I fall in love with an idea. Then when I really fall in love with an idea, I want to read that which debunks what I'm falling in love with. So I go through the thesis and then read the antithesis, and then I usually come out with some kind of synthesis, which lasts. So it's not true that I never stick to any one idea.
And you believe all sorts of stories about pink unicorns or whatever it is that you come to believe, but then wait a minute, you start learning, and you become more skeptical, right? And eventually you come to some medium between the two of those. Isn't that what Hegel was trying to say? We move from the thesis to the antithesis, the opposite, and then often what happens is we end up somewhere in the middle with what Hegel referred to as a synthesis. So Hegel believed that's how the mind works. So Strauss's thesis was simply this, that the Orthodox or conservative believe that God reveals God's self in history,
people like Catholics tend to believe that God reveals God's self in history. The opposite extreme, what's the opposite extreme? Rationalists of the Enlightenment, what do they believe? That there's no revealed religious truth. And so, on the one hand, one extreme, God reveals religion. The other one, there is no revealed religion. And so what's the synthesis? How it is that, well, let's take a look at how it is that these Gospels, what are they really? They are myths expressing universal truths. They express universal truths. So let's come to this happy medium.
Okay, so both Judaism, Christianity, and Islam claim to be historical religions. They claim that God has revealed himself in history to particular people at particular times. So according to this new book on David Friedrich Strauss, father of unbelief, it'd be foolish to think that Strauss refuted Christianity, but it'd be even more foolish to assume that one can ignore his criticisms. His critique put the onus of proof on the defenders of Christianity, and it remains a burden to this day. So the power of his critique almost destroyed Christianity in the 19th century. In the late 1830s, Strauss went through a gauntlet of criticisms from theologians of all confessions and parties, but it is painful to see how much his critics begged questions against him, how they failed to appreciate the challenge he posed. In the early 20th century, Albert Schweitzer and Karl Barth, two major Protestant theologians, acknowledged how much Strauss's critics had failed to answer him. Those who declared Strauss surpassed were precisely those who had been surpassed by him. So the great strength of his critique of Christianity, published in his book, The Life of Jesus, 1835, is that it was entirely immanent. It was entirely based within the internal text of the Gospels. It examined the Bible strictly according to its own claims of historical truth. It investigates the Bible according to the standards of historical criticism. It looked at things such as internal consistency, factual accuracy, and textual authenticity. So it did not critique the Gospels according to an external standard, whether it be a psychological theory like Nietzsche's or a scientific naturalism theory like Haeckel's and Buchner's. So it wasn't based on external criticisms and external critiques and external theories, but it was an internal critique. So his critique requires no metaphysics. He was a practitioner of the method then called historical critique, which asks who wrote these texts, when were they written, for whom, when were they written. So this is a technique that one uses to examine any historical document. David Friedrich Strauss is famous for his theory of myth. And so essentially he says his theory of myth is that you don't have to drop Christianity because the Gospels are not historical truths. George Eliot translated his Life of Jesus in 1846. Reaction to Strauss in the Anglo world never took on the dimensions that it had in Germany and France. In the 20th century, Strauss has been studied in the Anglo world mostly by those interested in the history of Hegelianism. So if we were to ask ourselves which books of the 19th century had the greatest effect on the decline of religion, we'd have to put first and foremost, before Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, we'd have to put David Friedrich Strauss's The Life of Jesus. Among scholars, the book has never been forgotten, and you can find the audio version of the book on YouTube. And to this day, it has inspired many an article or a book. But among the general public, particularly in the Anglo world, Strauss's name has none of the luster of Darwin's and is increasingly fading from memory. If you ask a philosopher or historian today who is David Friedrich Strauss, the reaction is likely to be a shrug. He's probably assumed to be a composer, some conflation with Richard Strauss, perhaps some kind of chocolate confectioner from Salzburg. Now, the effect of David Friedrich Strauss's book, The Life of Christ, Life of Jesus, published in 1835, was to shake dramatically and radically Christian faith in the historicity of the New Testament. It was no longer possible to believe that the New Testament was the product of divine inspiration, or that it was infallible or even remotely reliable, or a historical document. The fundamental faith that the Bible is a true historical narrative thus proved to be untenable, and that's why some thought that this would result in the utter destruction of Christianity.
Between the Catholics, the Christians, and the atheists. An example that he used is how it is that the creation story is a myth containing religious truths and filled with symbols, but not rooted in historical events. There were not just two people in a garden at the beginning of time. where God opened up the stomach of one and took out a rib and put it and made it into a human person. Right? I mean, we've heard these biblical stories. That's not historically what happened, but instead that these are stories that have universal truths. How it is that human beings were trying to make sense of the world, and so they came up with these stories to try to explain where we came from. And so, therefore, the question for him is this Christ of faith rooted in the Jesus of history? What conclusion would he come to? Not at all. Right? This Christ that y'all believe in, how that is, that's rooted in Jesus of history? I don't see it. He came up with the expression that the gospel is a pearl necklace of myths strung together. Wouldn't it be a great exam question for this course to be able to rebut that, right? If David Friedrich Strauss came in and said the gospel is a pearl necklace of myths strung together, how would you respond to that? What do you say to a person who said that? Strauss's conclusions then, what conclusions did he draw in his life? He said that yes, there are some truths in the gospel. For instance, that his conclusion, like Ramar's came to certain conclusions. Strauss came to certain conclusions, for instance, that Jesus was this supreme mystic. He had this vision of God, this idea of God that not a lot of people at this time had. He called God Father. That was pretty radical. So he was this mystic and an exemplar of our relationship with God. He talked about loving God and loving neighbor. It seems that he's an example for us to be able to follow. Wait a minute, are we sensing a high Christology or a low Christology? Strauss is obviously a low Christology. Jesus, or as Father Donald Buggart would call him, Saint Jesus, because in this, a low Christology is essentially a Saint Jesus Christology. What do we mean by that? Is a saint God? Saints are humans like us. Saint Monica, Saint Rose, Saint Julia, Saint George, Saint Edward, whatever saint you're talking about, they're those of what it was that Jesus did. Casting demons into swine, or doing whatever else it is that in the gospel. Okay, great stories arose. Or Q, who is Q? Literal histories arose, like Mark or Q. Q was that source that we believe influenced whom? Matthew and Luke. Right? Q is the German initial for the word Kel, which means source. Right? There's some source that influenced Matthew and Luke, because there are stories that Matthew and Luke have that are not in Mark, so they must have come from some source, and that source we refer to as Q. We've never found that source. It would be great to discover it. We've never discovered it, so we just call it Q. So that was Strauss. The questions that would arise then as we read Strauss is, who is Jesus? If you read Strauss, then what conclusion are you going to come to in terms of Jesus? Is Jesus different from us as human beings in terms of kind? Is he something other than human? Or is he just different in degree, meaning he's holier than us? He's simply saying Jesus. What conclusion can we come to as Christians? Is Jesus just different in degree, saying Jesus? Doesn't seem that that's acceptable. It seems that Jesus has to be different in kind from human beings. He has to be different from us. Conservatives reacted against Strauss's mythological interpretation and against Bruno Bauer's denial of the historical Jesus. Remember the name Bruno Bauer? Who was he? An atheist. Wow. So suddenly, we as Christians and as Catholics have to defend our faith. In our course on the theology of the diaconate and the priest, we refer to this as the time of the fortress church, which simply meant what? We as a church were on the defense. People were coming and attacking our ideas, which meant what? How do we defend ourselves? Liberals would say that Jesus is not God by nature, but is the fullest instance of graced humanity. So we have how it is that Strauss really created a reaction. Strauss and Bruno Bauer, these people, by raising questions, they really ruffled some feathers in the church and in theological circles, as you can imagine. When you start saying, for instance, that Jesus was simply a great ethical teacher who taught the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood and sisterhood of all humanity and the dignity of the human soul, okay, that's great, but I don't go to church on Sunday to worship that type of Jesus. That's a very low Christology.
Okay. So there's this new book on David Friedrich Strauss, Father of Unbelief. So his book, The Life of Jesus, first appeared in 1835 in 2 thick volumes, each consisting in around 750 pages. He applied the new method of historical criticism, which was developed in the first decades of the 19th century, to the complete story of the life of Jesus in the synoptic gospels, meaning Matthew, Mark, and Luke, from Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to his death on the cross in Jerusalem. Through an exacting and exhaustive study of all the sources, Strauss came to the conclusion that none of the gospel narratives are reliable as history, that the apostles were not eyewitnesses of the events they described, that they often contradicted one another, they are at odds with well-attested facts, and they were anything but impartial or objective. So according to Strauss, the apostles were desperate to justify their faith and to attract a following. They wrote their stories to prove that Jesus was the Messiah. What the ancient Jews expected of the Messiah, such as working miracles, healing the sick, and prophesying, was fulfilled fully by Jesus, the apostles claimed, and so the entire New Testament was written to try to meet the predictions of Jewish legend, the myths of the Messiah. So Strauss argued this would be easily confirmed by a careful comparison of the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible, which showed exactly how much the apostles borrowed from the ancient Jews. He came to his final damning verdict: the New Testament is not history, but myth. Now, the book was not new. Since the beginning of the 18th century, the idea that parts of the Bible are mythical had been steadily gaining ground. So Strauss was aware of historical precedents, he acknowledged them, and he built upon them. He never claimed to be new. What was original in his book was that for the first time, the whole theory and the whole body of work regarding the historicity of the Gospels was applied and taken to its full extent. So the vast majority of the Protestant population in the early 19th century still saw the Bible as the foundation of their faith. Protestant faith since the Reformation rested on Scripture, sola scriptura, on Scripture alone, sola fide, faith alone, sola Christos, Christ alone. But faith in Scripture presupposed its historical credibility. How much faith can you have on documents that are just factually and historically inaccurate? So in the Roman Catholic tradition, mystical and allegorical readings of the Bible were prevalent, but the Protestant reformers stressed the importance of the literal meaning of the Bible, and they claimed that an individual could just come to the Bible unaided by tradition and understand it. But to read the Bible literally was to read it historically. It was to assume that its reported miracles actually happened just as they were said to have happened, and it was this assumption that Strauss made the target of his criticism. Now, the reaction to Strauss's book among Protestants was drastic and dramatic. One contemporary described its effect as a bombshell, another likened it to an electric shock. Still another wrote about the panic-stricken terror among the general public. Strauss's book was the most controversial German publication of the entire 19th century. No other book aroused such a strong and sustained reaction. Protestants were shocked by the book because in questioning the historical credibility of the New Testament, Strauss seemed to attack the very basis of their faith. Faith rested on the Bible, and if the Bible were not credible, what basis could there be for faith? So for Orthodox Protestants in 1835, it seemed very much like the sky was falling. So here is atheist Greg Johnson speaking on a Sunday morning in a church a few years ago.
Good morning. I stood in this pulpit in this, my spiritual home. The first time was Palm Sunday of 2004, just before Easter. Now here I am on the fourth Sunday of Advent, just before Christmas. And these two Sundays bring home to me what makes Swedenborg so distinct and so important among Christian theologians. What attracted me initially to Swedenborg was his reputation as a spirit seer and a fellow who talked to people on other planets and things like that. That was the most, that attracted me. But what most impressed me in the end was his discussion of the life of Christ and the meaning and the mystery of that. Swedenborg did not just say, now it is permitted to understand the mystery of Jesus. He gives us that understanding in his final book, which is called True Christianity. In Isaiah 7, it is said, look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. In Matthew, book 1, it is said that Jesus is the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy and that the name Emmanuel means God is with us. Now, what does it mean to say that God is with us? Well, in the deepest metaphysical sense, God is with us still and always as creator and sustainer. But for Christians, God was with us in a different way for a while. He was with us as a man. Advent, from the Latin adventus, coming, is the period leading up to the anniversary of God's appearance as a man.
So Richard Spencer tweeted out this speech to make fun of Greg Johnson because Greg Johnson is an atheist and he has published many critical things about Christianity. So he's written in the Occidental Observer, Christianity did undermine racial exclusivity for nearly 2,000 years. Racial and subracial differences were no bar to marriage as long as both parties were Christian. Greg Johnson said Christianity will not be dead until its secular offspring, liberal universalism, is dead as well. Christian fanatics are precisely the ones who believe that blood differences don't matter. Now, Greg, in 2017, explained this sermon by saying Swedenborgian churches are filled with people who are interested in traditionalist and perennialist spiritual ideas, the kind of ideas that are one major tributary to the New Right and which are discussed all over countercurrents. Swedenborgians are very open-minded, like Unitarians, but actually religious or spiritual. They regularly invite all sorts of people to give Sunday messages, Buddhist monks, Jungian analysts, rabbis, William Blake scholars, and sometimes even Christians. I've given 4 or 5 such sermons because I did a lot of research into Swedenborg's theology. Instead of just giving a lecture on a topic of my choosing, I acted like a guest in their house and thus did a sermon according to the practices of their church. I always chose to follow the church lectionary and construct a sermon based on the assigned readings from the Old and New Testament using ideas from Swedenborg's theology. I wanted to show the richness of their own spiritual tradition. In my own beliefs, I am not Christian, and I've come to reject the idea that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are consistent with traditionalist ideas.
It happened in history. We don't know exactly when, but a finite number of years, days, hours, minutes, and seconds ago, about 2014 years ago, a child was born, a child who was also somehow the God of eternity. This unique incarnation is the great mystery. It's the conundrum of theologians. It's the embarrassment of metaphysicians. Why was Jesus born? Why did God become man? Swedenborg claims that this was not part of Plan A. Jesus was not co-eternal with God, always present, just biding his time, waiting for his moment when he appeared on the stage of history to do his salvation thing. Jesus was Plan B, set in motion because of certain contingencies, certain things that did not have to happen, but did. When I was a kid, my brother and I would get into such fights, and then our father would thunder down from upstairs, "Don't make me come down there." That was Plan A. And usually it was enough. But sometimes when we were really naughty, he had to come down there and set things right, and that was Plan B. Swedenborg claims that God could not prevent the whole human race from going to hell. Now, what does that mean? Can't God do anything at all? Can't he make us good? Can't he force us to mind? Well, no, he can't, given that God decided to make us free. He cannot make us obey him without unmaking us as free beings. So once God decided that man would be free, he gave up a certain amount of his power over us. And this introduced contingencies into the world. Once man became free in imitation of God, we became co-creators with God in our own little corner of the universe, the realm of freedom and history.
So intellectuals are very much into symbols. So even though Greg Johnson doesn't believe in Christianity or that Jesus was divine, he's happy to take on the intellectual challenge and the moral challenge of giving a Sunday morning sermon in a church. So the hostile reaction to David Friedrich Strauss's 1835 book, The Life of Jesus, imposed a harsh fate upon him, and I sometimes wonder if my own shenanigans have imposed such a harsh fate upon me. Trained in the famous Tübinger Stift, so this is a Protestant seminary in the town of Tübinger in Germany, to become a cleric or a theologian, Strauss found himself banished from these professions. It was impossible for him to find employment as a preacher or a professor. He was forced to work as an independent author and to live off the meager royalties of his writings. Having acquired the reputation of an antichrist, and there are a lot of Seventh-day Adventists when I was growing up who regarded my father as an antichrist or the antichrist. So David Strauss was shunned by colleagues and friends. They feared for their reputations and careers if they were known to associate with him. So Glib Medley has made the point in the chat that nobody has had their reputation enhanced by connection with Luke Ford. So Strauss became a lonely, bitter, and isolated man. He never joined a profession. He never formed a lasting marriage. He never enjoyed domestic happiness. He wandered around Germany from one city to another: Stuttgart, Heilbronn, Munich, Darmstadt, Cologne, Weimar, and Heidelberg. He never found a stable home. All the rest of his days, except for a brief, disastrous marriage, he led the life of a sad recluse. Who does this remind you of? 25 years after the publication of the first edition of his work, The Life of Jesus, he summarized the effects of his book on his life and career. It excluded me from public teaching, for which I had desire and perhaps even talent. It tore me out of natural relationships and drove me into unnatural ones, made the course of my life lonely. So I think that rings true for pretty much anyone who's a dissident.
Since they teach a way to eternal salvation, the scriptures are seen as being themselves eternal, written or dictated by God. In every faith, the scribes take great pains to keep the text accurate. Everywhere, the text is so important that great traditions of calligraphy have developed to express the preciousness of every letter. These are sacred words, charged with power. the holy books are more and more sumptuously produced, and commonly wrapped in linen to protect their holiness. Having come from heaven, they may themselves become cult objects. Often, unbelievers were forbidden to touch them. In monasteries, schools, and places of worship, the scriptures are chanted until people know them by heart. Knowing by heart, a significant phrase. In a religious culture based on a holy book, the language of the book sinks so deep into people's souls that it creates their world. As the centuries pass, the book is enriched by the labours of commentators, and new meanings are given to it. Religious institutions may grow and change greatly, but where people lack a sense of history, it continues to be assumed that the book validates them all.
Of the holy word of God, I tell you tonight.
It was Martin Luther who originated that appeal to the Bible alone. He regarded the whole development of Christianity since New Testament times as a story of corruption. At Worms, he pitted the Bible against the Church. By thus opposing scripture to tradition, Luther forced Christianity to examine itself. What is the relation between the Bible and historical change? Is the Bible exalted above history, or is it embedded within our human history and open to continual reinterpretation as times change? Here was a challenge to theologians and a minefield for them. Luther's theologian, Philip Melanchthon, established a Protestant stronghold at the University of Tübingen in southern Germany, and up to Hans Küng in our own day, Tübingen has remained one of the historic centres of the struggle between the Church and avant-garde theologians. The great philosophers Schelling and Hegel had passed through here in the 1790s, and here in 1825 came the 17-year-old David Friedrich Strauss with a gifted group of school friends.
So Chaim Maccabee's analysis of the New Testament is very much influenced by this 19th century Tübingen University and Protestant school of biblical analysis. So let me share a little bit more from this new book, The Father of Unbelief, new book on David Friedrich Strauss. So Strauss was a very symbolic figure in Germany. The Orthodox saw him as an antichrist. Liberal intellectuals regarded him as a martyr for free thinking. The free thinker was someone who was willing to take his thinking to its ultimate limits, someone who had the courage of his convictions and who stated his views in public regardless of the consequences. This was an admirable ideal, but living by it was very dangerous in an age when religion was still closely guarded by the state. And Strauss's sad life became a warning to all dissidents. Watch what you say if you want to keep your reputation and your livelihood. And in suffering for his ideal, David Strauss resembled no one more than Lessing, who underwent a similar fate. So who's Lessing? Gotthold Ephraim Lessing lived from 1729 to 1781. He was a German writer and philosopher, and he published some pamphlets where he argued for Christians' right for freedom of thought. He argued against belief in revelation and holding to a literal interpretation of the Bible. And his analysis was called Lessing's Ditch. He outlined the concept of the religious proof of power. How can miracles continue to be used as a basis for Christianity where we have no proof of miracles? Historical truths which are in doubt cannot be used to prove metaphysical truths such as God's existence. That then is the ugly great ditch which I cannot cross. However often, however earnestly I have tried to make that leap. So he would get into feuds with Orthodox Christians, and some of the people who got into feuds with him would request the government to put an end to their literary feuds. And Lessing was eventually silenced through a law that took away his freedom from censorship. And in response, he wrote plays. Most influential play was Nathan the Wise. He set up a tension between Judaism, Islam, and Christianity by having one character ask Nathan which religion was the most genuine. Nathan avoids the question by telling the parable of the three rings, which implies that no specific religion is the correct religion. So Lessing was very much a man of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment believed that people were basically good and that they could find their way to even more goodness through the use of reason. And Nathan the Wise is considered the first example of Germany's literature of humanity. He trusted in a Christianity of reason. He believed that human reason would develop, and without any help of divine revelation would create a better world. So this idea of freedom for the theater, for religion from church dogma, for the writer, for the intellectual is the central theme throughout his life. He stood up for the liberation of the upcoming middle and upper classes from the nobility, making up their minds for them. In his writings, he constantly strove for independence. So he didn't come on his live streams and just tell people what they wanted to hear, no matter how unpopular it made him, no matter the consequences to his life, no matter if people unsubscribe from his channel, no matter if people stopped super chatting him, no matter if he burned all his bridges, he just pursued truth. My man, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, very much like my other man under discussion today, David Friedrich Strauss. So in his worst years, Strauss was consoled by the thought of Lessing, whom he embraced as his hero, and then Strauss would in turn become a model for others. So I've occasionally have vulnerable young people say, Luke, when I grow up, I want to be just like you. So as Lessing was to Strauss, Strauss was to the young Friedrich Nietzsche, who was inspired by him. The net effect of Strauss's book on his generation was to force it to make a choice. One could retreat under the banner of faith, or one could push forward with criticism. There was no middle path where one could use reason to justify faith. In the 1770s, Lessing had presented the challenge with a similar dilemma. Now Strauss was renewing the challenge.
Lovers of Mozart and ardent romantics, they were entering Arcadia. Students for the Protestant ministry lived in a theological college called the Stift. Strauss and his friends did a 5-year course. For scholarship boys of modest origins, the seminary was the natural path to advancement. Strauss graduated top of his year. Inevitably, after a brief spell in a parish and a pilgrimage to Berlin to hear the master Hegel, he came back here as a lecturer.
So I remember hearing once a rabbi talk about a gathering of seminary students. There were Christians and there were Jews, and when the Christians got up to talk about why they wanted to enter either the priesthood or the ministry, they talked about how God had spoken to them and they felt a call to divine service. And when the rabbis got up and spoke, or the rabbinic students got up and spoke, they talked about how they didn't get into the business school of their choice, or they didn't want to be a doctor or a dentist. So the Jewish approach to the rabbinate and choosing that profession was, far more pragmatic than Christians. So you very rarely hear Jews talk, God called me, because one way you can understand the differences between Christianity and Judaism is that 2,000 years ago, some Jews came up with the idea that God had communicated a new revelation to them. And so they split off from the main body of Jewry and created Christianity. So Jews tend to be quite skeptical of God directly communicating with people in the modern age and telling them to do specific things. Christians, by contrast, feel quite free to say, God moved me to call you. God moved me to talk to you. I remember once I was making out with this young woman in my car after a party, and I moved her hand down towards my stomach, and she said, "No, we need to pray first." So she then made the most eloquent prayer. I was living out of my car at the time, so she said, "Dear Jesus, Luke's living in his car. He's going through a tough time. He's just new in Los Angeles. And I really pray that you'll help him and you'll enter his life." And then we went on to the hand job, and then we went on to the whole Megillah. But Jews don't tend to speak nearly as much about, God directed them to give a hand job.
He was only 25 when he began to write the theological book of the century, his Life of Jesus. Now, Hegel had taught Strauss that in different periods in history, the human mind works in different ways. Strauss applied this idea to the Gospels. If we can grasp how the evangelist minds worked, what made them write the way they did, then we can undercut the boring old arguments about whether the miracles actually happened or not. Strauss calls this new approach his mythical interpretation. Here's an example to show what he means. Our ancestors believed in angels. Today we hear little about angels. Instead, we're preoccupied with extraterrestrials. Now, why has there been that change? Answer: angels fitted into the old worldview and met people's needs. People wanted to know that God was not indifferent or remote, but through his servants, his ministers, guarded and guided them. Today we have a scientific worldview and rather different problems. We need to feel that we're not alone in the universe. So our stories about extraterrestrials are expressions of our religious needs. Now, whether there actually are any angels or extraterrestrials, I've no idea. We lack evidence. The point is that we've come to see all such ideas as expressions of the religious imagination shaped by the preoccupations of the time. They had their myths, we have ours. Strauss applied these ideas to the Gospels, showing them to be myths, products of the early Christian religious imagination. That was what caused the offense. Strauss could work it all out because he had a pretty good idea of how the Gospel writers' minds worked. They were steeped in the Old Testament, its great heroes and stories. And they believed that Jesus, as the promised Messiah, must have fulfilled it all. Now the Gospel story begins to take shape.
Then was Jesus led up of the Spirit into the wilderness, to be tempted of the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was afterward an hungered.
In the Old Testament, King David had been filled with the Spirit when Samuel anointed him. So now, Jesus the
Okay, we have some breaking news. Donald Trump is apparently reconciling with Steve Bannon. So President Donald Trump has repeatedly spoken by phone in recent weeks with once estranged White House advisor Steve Bannon, who's facing federal criminal charges. Trump has been seeking counsel on his campaign to overturn his re-election defeat. The president has sought out allies who would tell him what he wants to hear as he promulgates false claims that the election was stolen from him. It is not clear how many times the men have spoken or how recently, but Steve Bannon has made considerable efforts to get back in Trump's good graces since he departed as the president's chief strategist in August 2017. During Trump's first impeachment in 2019 and 2020, Bannon launched a podcast called War Room, in which he and other Trump allies publicly defended the president. Bannon used his podcast to support Trump's widely criticized response to the pandemic, to advocate for the president's re-election, and then to back the president's claims that the outcome was fraudulent after he was defeated by Joe Biden. Okay, so that is not a surprise. I always thought that Trump and Bannon would get back together. I thought it would happen prior to the 2020 election, however.
Son of David must have been filled with the Spirit after his baptism, his anointing as the Messiah. Israel crossed the Red Sea and spent 40 years in the wilderness. So Christ, the new Israel, on leaving the Jordan, spends 40 days in the wilderness. It was a time of testing for Israel, so it must also have been a time of testing for Jesus. But where Israel succumbs to temptation, Jesus triumphs. Jesus' temptation story was modeled on Israel's. Strauss is saying that there's no need to read the New Testament as a record of supernatural events. If Jesus was indeed the promised Messiah, the long-awaited Christ, then for the early Christian writers, his story virtually wrote itself. He must have been a teacher greater than Moses, a prophet and miracle worker surpassing even Elijah. Thus, the story of the transfiguration of Christ, for example, can be and was put together entirely out of Old Testament materials.
And after 6 days Jesus taketh Peter, James, and John his brother, and bringeth them up into an high mountain apart, and was transfigured before them. And his face did shine as the sun, and his raiment was white as the light.
The story reminds us of something we've heard before.
Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. And the skin of Moses' face shone, because he had been talking with God.
Along similar lines, it's possible to assemble the entire nativity story out of the Old Testament.
The prophet Micah. But thou, Bethlehem, out of thee shall he come forth that is to be ruler in Israel. Numbers. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter out of Israel. Isaiah. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Isaiah. The ox knoweth his owner, and the ass his master's crib.
And we have another breaking news story. Large Bitcoin payments to right-wing activists a month before Capitol riot linked to foreign account. December 8, someone made a simultaneous transfer of 28.15 Bitcoins worth more than $500,000 at the time to 22 different virtual wallets, most of them belonging to prominent right-wing organizations and personalities. So if you want to get donations, you often have to say or do ridiculous things or hold to ridiculous standards. For example, Commentary Magazine, to ensure ongoing support from evangelical Christians, discourages any publication referencing Darwin's theory of evolution. So the transfer came just a month before the violent riot in the Capitol. Right-wing figures and websites, including VDare, the Daily Stormer, Nick Fuentes, received generous donations from a Bitcoin account linked to a French cryptocurrency exchange. So yeah, the easiest ways to get massive amounts of money is to do ridiculous things. So law enforcement and intelligence agencies are actively investigating the sources of funding for the individuals who participated in the Capitol insurrection, as well as their networks. One of the ways extremist groups have made money in recent years, shock horror, is online through cryptocurrency and crowdfunding. 2017 Washington Post investigation explored how far-right groups turned even more aggressively toward Bitcoin following the deadly August 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Southern Poverty Law Center identified a large Bitcoin donation to Andrew Anglin of approximately $60,000. Some prominent right-wing groups or sites display their Bitcoin wallets prominently. The lack of regulation over Bitcoin has driven its adoption by white supremacists. Bitcoin is pseudonymous rather than anonymous. Bitcoin wallet addresses are permanent. And the digital ledger of transactions, called the blockchain, is public and cannot be changed. That means if people identify their Bitcoin wallet addresses, transactions can be traced. Okay, let's get back to David Friedrich Strauss.
Psalms. And Gentiles shall come to thy light, and kings to the brightness of thy rising. The kings of Tarshish and of the isles shall bring presents, and the kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts.
Strauss argues that given their beliefs about Old Testament prophecies of the Messiah, it was natural for Matthew and Luke to use the Old Testament as a source of information about Jesus' birth. This was how, they thought, it must have been. They devolved a mythic narrative to express their faith.
And he applied his mythical interpretation even to the resurrection. He knew there'd be trouble. Yet he remained a Christian. He'd no doubt of the historical existence of Jesus, and he thought that the early Christian beliefs about him were expressions valid in their day of moments in the spiritual life of every one of us. It did him no good. When the book appeared, all hell broke loose.
After Volume 1 came out in June 1835, Strauss was dismissed. No theologian of repute could defend him publicly, and he couldn't even visit his friends for fear of injuring their reputations. He never held another full-time job. Some people regarded him as the Antichrist. Others pointed out that Strauss means ostrich, and in the Bible, ostriches signify desolation and rejection by God. In this cartoon, Strauss helps the common man to fell the cross, in spite of the efforts of the church press to hold it up. Above, the emperor, through his minister Eichhorn, whose name meant squirrel, lets fall a shower of honours and decorations into the eager hands of the faithful sheep below. Gradually, Strauss moved or was pushed out of Christianity altogether. When he died in 1874, he was found to have left instructions that he should not receive Christian burial. One of his old school friends gave an address instead, and by a last irony nearly lost his own job for having done so.
I long to travel. Now I do not leave. But whether I shall stay, I do not know. That I'm a stranger in this land is certain. But where my homeland is, I do not know. I think I once had 2 beloved children. But whether it was a dream, I do not know. They say that once upon a time I'd written books. But whether truth or scorn, I do not know. I hear...
Yeah, guess what? If you want to do heroic things that go against the popular views of the day, you're going to pay a pretty stiff price.
An unbeliever I am called. I know not if I am not rather pious. The thought of death has never caused me fear. I know not if I have not long been dead.
Strauss was driven out of academic theology and out of the church, but his ideas have not died. Many are now commonplace. Others, such as his view of the incarnation, are still controversial, but at least they're widely available and debated rather than persecuted.
In this kind of theology, truth is no longer a matter of fixed positions. Nobody's told to shut up because his views are immoral. Instead, truth has become a moving debate, in which the consensus of opinion depends upon the merits of the argument as it develops.
Okay, so death anxiety. Did you know that death acceptance can help relieve your anxiety? I just read this article on The Fix. Accepting that death is part of the normal cycle of life can help alleviate stress during the pandemic. Death is the one certainty in life. We're all going to die at some point. There's little we can do to control when or how. Coming to peace with that can alleviate stress during your life and free you to focus on living life to the fullest while you can. So press 1 if you have death acceptance. So my father would often say, I don't give a cracker for this life. He was much more invested in the next world, which is going to be much, much better. All right, back to our book, David Friedrich Strauss, father of unbelief. So Strauss grabbed the horn of historical criticism. He believed it was the duty of everyone to examine the grounds of morality and religion, said that it was impossible to rest content with the imposition of any arbitrary limit on inquiry. The modern individual could never accept the appeal to authority, whether it came from the state or the church. He could rely on reason alone. That was the only criterion of assent. But was there not a danger that inquiry would never cease, and that it might ultimately result in skepticism or nihilism? In the 1830s, Strauss was convinced that the quest for reason would ultimately end. and would finally come to rest in Hegel's philosophy. By the 1840s, Strauss had to abandon even that ultimate certainty as the fate of the modern individual. He now taught to accept a life of limitless inquiry, which led to no ultimate certainty. Now, this book, The Life of Jesus, also occupies an important place in the history of German politics. Its publication gave rise to a controversy that would dominate German politics for the next 10 years. This dispute concerned the degree to which the Christian revelation could be explained and justified according to Hegel's system of philosophy. So, according to David Strauss, this Hegelian school could be divided into three camps, according to the extent to which they were willing to accommodate all Christian revelation into Hegel's system of philosophy. Right-wing Hegelians held that all Christian revelation could be accommodated by philosophy. Centrist Hegelians held that some, and left Hegelians held that none of the Christian revelation conforms to philosophy. So, David Friedrich Strauss maintained that all evangelical Christian history is really myth. He implies that none of it conforms to the truth, and so he seems to stand on the far side of the left political spectrum, but is actually a political moderate. Now, his Life of Jesus is a strikingly non-political book. Its contents entirely confined to explaining the text of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Its tone and its style strive to be neutral and objective, and they give away nothing about the author's political attitudes. So why does this strikingly non-political book have so much political significance? So eventually, Strauss would run for politics. So the 1830s was a period of political reaction, with governments struggling to counter the liberal ideas flowing from the July Revolution in France, and to defend their legitimacy, governments clung often to the old doctrine of the unity of throne and alter the bond between state and church, the doctrine that the sovereign, the ruler, is God's representative on earth, and that he rules in virtue of the authority that God has given him. And this doctrine was held to derive from divine revelation, which was found in Scripture. So this was a doctrine that went back for hundreds and hundreds of years into the Middle Ages, but it still was living on in 19th century Germany. So government and conservative circles in Germany still relied on the authority of the Bible essentially to legitimate the state. So Strauss's book was an absolute outrage for them, because his thesis was that Christian revelation, the basis of the conservative theory of the state, had no reliable historical foundation and should be regarded as a myth, which seemed to knock the bottom out of the conservative reliance on revelation to support their claim to political legitimacy. So this is why there was panic-stricken terror gripping the German public upon first hearing news of David Friedrich Strauss's 1835 book, The Life of Jesus.
But many people can't stand living without the old certainties. For them, there's another kind of religious book. In this shop on the other side of town, no views are heard but those of conservative evangelicalism. Free debate, critical questioning are eliminated. Here, faith is untroubled. About half the outlets for religious books in Britain are of this type. But meanwhile, the churches have a very serious problem in trying to reconcile and contain within themselves the struggle between two radically opposed mentalities. In that struggle, many theologians have fallen casualty. But occasionally, one of them, perhaps through what he does, manages to break through popular suspicion and become a kind of hero. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of them.
Whoa.
And here's another. Surrounded in his later years by too much adulation and then
Okay, Albert Schweitzer there, the quest for the historical Jesus. Wow, Josh Randall is knocking it out of the park. $20 if you'll publicly state that Laponius Maximus Meridius possesses razor wit and quips. Laponius Maximus Meridius possesses razor wit and insight. 20 more shekels if you'll admit that half Galician was the godfather that synthesized the first black pill. Whoa, Josh, thank you so much for your generosity. Half Galician is my favorite nihilist. So thank you. 20 more shekels. Okay, what else? 20 shekels if you'll give Laponius Maximum Meridius a shout out. Wow, YouTube wants me to buy my own super chat. Wow. I feel the love in the room. Do you feel the love? I did not blow your super shekel off like it was dandruff. I was waiting to give it the appropriate. No, I take my yarmulke off if that would not be sacrilege. Sounds so odd, sped up. Yeah, I think I'm playing that video. Mozart work in the background is like excessive vibrato. Mozart's dissonance quartet. Actually, it's not sped up, Philip Daniel. This is a little known and only recently discovered Mozart dissonance quartet. So this is actually played at 1.0 speed, but most people are not aware of the Mozart dissonance quartet, which truly changed the direction of music irrevocably. Sweet, sweet voter fraud shekels. Voter fraud shekels are the best shekels.
Subsequently debunked, Albert Schweitzer is now an enigma. The sentimental image of the missionary doctor has concealed the true story of his life and faith.
Okay, let's get something a little more scholarly. I know you guys love the scholarly.
Okay, we are on to scholarly skepticism, a name that is my coinage, so don't go hunting in the literature for it or you'll find something random. But I needed something by which to distinguish a kind of skepticism that we find principally in two figures, David Friedrich Strauss and Ernest Renan, who don't quite fit the Hegelian mold of the Tübingen school. So I'm going to treat them separately, and today I'm going to focus on Strauss, and in particular on Strauss's first work, his Leben Jesu kritisch bearbeitet, his Life of Jesus critically worked at or worked over. I thought of two mottos for today's talk, and so I'm going to give you both of them before we plunge in. One is from Aristotle's Politics. Here and elsewhere, says Aristotle, we shall not obtain the best insights into things until we actually see them growing from the beginning. In deference to Aristotle, I'm going to take you through the origins of the kind of German skepticism which ultimately flower in Strauss so that you can see how he came to the position he did. Second quotation is from Butler's Analogy of Religion, very important work from the middle of the deist controversy in the 1730s. Butler is speaking of the cumulative nature of the evidences of Christianity, and he says, "It is obvious how much advantage the nature of this evidence gives to those persons who attack Christianity, especially in conversation. For it is easy to show in a short and lively manner that such and such things are liable to objection, that this and another thing is of little weight in itself, but impossible to show in like manner the united force of the argument in one view." That kind of piecemeal criticism we have already seen, particularly in Thomas Paine, but you'll see again how Strauss has a myopic approach. He's focused on details. And whether he's right or wrong about those, he just has no sense of the overall picture, and his critics will come and criticize him on just those grounds.
Okay, back to this biography, intellectual biography of David Friedrich Strauss, father of unbelief. So, according to Strauss, the central theme of Christianity is the unity of the infinite and the finite, but it's not instantiated in just one individual alone, the Christ, but it's to be found in all individuals in the finite world. So Strauss claimed that Christ was the preeminent example of divinity in history, but he still insisted this was only one example and that we cannot deny divinity to humanity as a whole. So this thesis does not sound terribly political now, but its implications were in pre-1840 radical. So the doctrine was intended and understood as a theological rationale for human equality, freedom, and democracy, the central political ideals of the 1830 French Revolution. If God is within everyone, then they are all sources of sovereignty. No one can claim to be especially favored or authorized by God. So neither the clergyman in his pulpit nor the prince on his throne can claim to be above the ordinary man. That authority should therefore come from the bottom up rather than from the top down, because the source of legitimacy and sovereignty lies in everyone, not just the favored few.
Some characteristics of scholarly skepticism is centered in Germany, spreads outward from there. In its first phase, it's influenced very heavily by Hume and other deists like Tyndall, but relatively little by Hegel. There is some Hegelian influence. We'll talk more about that as we go along. Hegel obtained a university position in 1816, I believe. But the Hegelian influence is not as pronounced as it will be in the works of people like Bauer and his followers in the Tübingen tradition. It has roots, however, in earlier writers like Reimarus and Lessing. Strauss's Life of Jesus was translated into English by the novelist George Eliot, real name Marianne Evans. Evans had been raised an evangelical Methodist and fell into the company of Charles Hennell and his daughter Sarah and others of like mind, and lost her faith and became a sort of genteel freethinker. The second flowering of this kind of skepticism comes in books by Ernst Renan, like The Life of Jesus and The Apostles. We'll take a look at those on Thursday, if time permits. So I want to go back to someone who stands closer to the fountainhead of this kind of thing in Germany, and that's Hermann Samuel Reimarus. Reimarus, philosopher and theologian, he was the son-in-law of the German classical scholar Fabricius. So if you see references to Fabricius, there is that connection there. During his lifetime, he worked in various positions, finally became professor of Hebrew and Oriental languages at the high school, where he had himself, I believe, attended, and maintained that position despite invitations to go elsewhere. We are a long way from a world where high schools hire professors of Hebrew and Oriental languages. We can reflect on that some other time. During his lifetime, he wrote a manuscript which he circulated to a few family and friends, but he did not publish it, and that was his apology for, or some words in defense of, reasoning worshippers of God. It is, in effect, a work of deism. He rejects the New Testament accounts and the Old Testament accounts, particularly of miracles. He insists that inconsistencies in the narratives invalidate them as far as their historical worth, and you'll recognize in both of those moves that he makes the seeds of something that we see fully bloomed in Strauss. Parts of this work were published subsequently by Lessing, but without attributing them to Reimarus. His authorship of them became known only later. So let's have just a quick glance at Lessing. He was an influential German philosopher, playwright, and literary critic. He was a correspondent with Reimarus' daughter, published the fragments. When he published the Withenbittel fragments, he came to the attention of the censor in Germany, who then stopped him from publishing any further theological works. Now, Lessing, of course, could say with some show of plausibility that he hadn't endorsed the fragments, he was merely publishing them, but the censor saw through that. So in response, Lessing wrote a play, Nathan the Wise, which he published in 1779. And that play has a story of 3 rings in it, and the 3 rings represent the 3 major monotheistic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And the moral of the story appears to be that none of these can claim to be the sole truth, and that the way to tell whether a man is right with God is not to look at his doctrine, but to look at his life, his manner of acting towards his fellow men. So for Lessing, Christianity is reduced to a set of moral precepts which may be useful for the right kind of person.
So that's a very Jewish perspective, that man in the final analysis is judged by God on his deed, not on his creed. So one way of understanding the differences between Judaism and Christianity is that in Judaism, the emphasis is on deed rather than creed. In Christianity, the emphasis is on creed more than deed. So Judaism was about 3,000 years old before it developed its first widely discussed creed, which was created by Moses Maimonides in the 13th century. By contrast, Christians were already arguing and killing each other over creed within 100, 150 years of the death of Christ.
Someone else might find other moral precepts useful as long as they broadly conform to what we can all sort of sense is right. Here are some things Reimarus has to say about miracles. I'm taking all of these quotations from an edition of the fragments published in the 1870s, edited by Charles Voysey. Voysey says that he did not translate them from the German. A friend of his did that, and he is merely editing them and presenting them, occasionally changing a bit of wording, but not the sense of it. So here are some quotations from Reimarus in Voysey's edition. To discover whether miracles are true requires as much investigation as the thing they are to prove. Therefore, if you wanted to prove something, why not just set out and do the work to establish it directly? Why take this trip around the barn trying to use miracles to do it? It's a circuitous way to try to arrive at something you should be able to demonstrate more directly. If you read the little piece on the spirit of truth and of power that we had from Lessing that sort of framed continental skepticism of a certain kind, you'll remember that Lessing also felt that appeal to miracles was a roundabout and dubious way of trying to establish things that, if they were true at all, ought to be visibly true. We should be able to see their truth directly. Again, after having ripped on some Old Testament miracles, he says the miracles of the New Testament are not so outrageous and disgusting as those of the Old, but yet the writers entangle themselves hopelessly here and there in glaring contradiction, and nowhere do they accord to us a report of circumstances and reliable investigation from which one could judge whether the thing supposed to have happened was a bona fide miracle.
So you might think that David Friedrich Strauss, the father of unbelief, was politically radical, but he was not. He was a moderate liberal. He stood between radical and reactionary, between the extreme right and the extreme left. He stood for basic political freedoms, freedom of conscience and the press, the rights of the citizen, separation of church and state. He stood for constitutional government and national unity. He stood at the center rather than the left wing of liberal politics, because he also believed in the retention of the monarchy. He was persistently opposed to the left wing and the more radical factions of Parliament. He criticized their demagoguery, their lack of respect for law and order, their passion for destruction rather than reconstruction. And you may think, He was widely accused of being a radical critic intent on destroying Christianity. And from the very beginning, he protested against this interpretation. He wrote in the first paragraph of the final chapter of his book, The Life of Jesus, the results of the previous investigation is that everything the Christian believes about Jesus has been destroyed, that all encouragement his faith had given him has been taken away, that he is robbed of all consolation. The infinite treasure of truth and life, which have nourished humanity for the last 18 centuries, appears to have been turned to waste, the most sublime truths crushed into dust. The mercy of God and the dignity of man have been lost, and the bond between heaven and earth has been torn into shreds. But Strauss warns his readers that this analysis is premature. Nothing is more dear to him, he assures his readers, than maintaining the fundamental truths of Christianity. His aim is not to destroy Christianity, but to preserve it. He wants to replace the traditional historical foundation with a new speculative foundation. So he certainly was intent on a thorough historical critique of the New Testament. And in that respect, his aim was entirely negative, to show that the New Testament is not a reliable historical document. But his target was a very limited and specific one, the doctrine that Christianity must be based on history, must be based on the reports of revelation in the New Testament. To Strauss, this undermined Christianity because these reports and dogmas and texts are easily exposed as myths. So if one rests one's faith on these reports, which turn out to be false, then faith itself would collapse. And he wanted to prevent this kind of disaster. He therefore wished to remove the rotten historical foundation of Christianity and prepare the ground for a speculative foundation. So the central dogmas of Christianity were not to be destroyed, but to be rescued. Only their historical form was to be negated, but their conceptual content was to be preserved.
So they're not as outrageous as Old Testament miracles tend to be, but still, we can have no confidence in them. Conclusion he unsurprisingly draws from premises like these is that those who would build Christianity upon miracles give it nothing firm, deep, or substantial for a foundation. That phrase should set you thinking about some other writers, particularly some urbane critics like Matthew Arnold, who wanted to say there's something timeless, permanent, eternally valuable in Christianity, but miracles are the wrong way to establish it. They're the wrong kind of foundation to give it. What are the signs of truth and falsehood? Well, the unerring signs of truth and falsehood are clear, distinct consistency for truth and contradiction for falsehood. This is also the case with revelation insofar as that it must, in common with other truths, be free from contradiction. Now, you've seen similar statements in Paine and Strauss, and we'll talk a little bit about Andrew Norton's critique of Strauss later, but just note the blank way this is stated. Clear, distinct consistency and contradiction. How about prophecy? Well, here's remarks on prophecy. If prophecy is to be called infallible, I fairly demand that it should state beforehand, legibly, clearly, and distinctly that which no man could previously have known, and that the same should thereafter take place at the time appointed, but that it should not take place because it has been predicted. No fulfillment of the prophecy because you already know about the prediction. If, however, such a prophecy can only be verified through allegorical interpretation of words and things, if it can be only composed of dark and dubious words, and the expressions it contains are commonplace, vague, and uncertain, if the matter was thought probable, or was foreseen by human cunning, if it occurs because it was predicted, if the words used refer to some other matter and are only applied to the prophecy by a quibble, if it is only written down after the event has occurred, if a prophetic book or passage is given out to be older than it is, or lastly, if the thing predicted does not take place at all, then the prophecy is either doubtful or false.
Okay, so I'm reading another interesting book. I'm on a kick reading about historicism, which means to place everything in its historical context. So I'm reading a 1999 book called Religion and the Rise of Historicism. And it's W.M.L. DeWitt. His full name was Wilhelm Martin Lebrecht DeWitt. So W.M.L. DeWitt, Jacob Burckhardt, and the Theological Origins of 19th Century Historical Consciousness. So Wilhelm Martin Lebrecht DeWitt lived from 1780 to 1849. He was a German theologian and Bible scholar. Jacob Burckhardt was the son of a Protestant clergyman, the religious leader in Basel, Switzerland. He was his son. He came to university. He studied under Wilhelm DeWitt and promptly lost his Christian faith. And so he didn't want to then reinterpret Christianity in metaphorical terms. Instead, he devoted himself to the study of history. So he's one of the first historians, according to John Lukács, who rises above the narrow 19th century notion that history is past politics and politics current history. And Burckhardt made his love of history his substitute religion. So there's a good line in this book where an American theologian in 1835, commenting on his impressions of German academic theology, there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. So Germans had the world's most dominant universities. They were the most important intellectuals in the 19th, early 20th century. They dominated the fields of theology and biblical scholarship in addition to philosophy. And here's a good quote. "History is an abyss in which Christianity has been catapulted quite against its will." And so Wilhelm de Witt, the Bible scholar and theologian, once noted that to satisfy the sensibilities of lay listeners, a preacher will inevitably compromise his absolute commitment to the truth. So my father was academically trained. He had 2 different PhDs. He taught at Seventh-day Adventist colleges for decades, but he would adjust his teachings when he was speaking to a lay audience so there'd be something that they could more easily comprehend. And so if you wanted to be nasty about it, you'd say he was, watering down his commitment to truth. But many academics have no interest in participating in popular forums. Like they don't want to go on Fox News or CNN because they would have to dumb down what they're saying for the masses. So for many academics, they see themselves as having an absolute commitment to truth, and they fear that dealing with the masses will compromise this absolute commitment. Now, de Witt was fired due to social political changes in Germany around 1818. He went to Basel, Switzerland, took up an academic post there, and once there, he began accepting preaching and public speaking engagements. So in a complete reversal of his earlier views expressed in Berlin, he gradually arrived at the conviction that the interests of Christian truth were not served by confusing lay audiences with sophisticated theological speculation. So he chose phrases that had common ground with Orthodox views, Orthodox Christian views, small o Orthodox. He spoke of the nature of Christ as mysterious, and his more candid positions were reserved for university lectures and publications. So my father, as a Christian theologian, his more candid positions were reserved for those that he trusted, just like if you're a political dissident and you still want to have a life that works, if you still want to succeed in above ground society, you will reserve your more candid positions for the people that you trust. And so Greg Johnson, who's an atheist and who tends to have fairly negative views of Christianity, he can still take up the challenge of giving a sermon in a Christian church, as he does here approximately 10 years ago.
God's ultimate goal for us is that we all be saved and join him in heaven, but many of us have other plans. Now, once God made man free, God had to persuade us to choose salvation, and he had to do it by adopting human forms. At first, he sent angels and prophets whose words he inspired, and this really was the equivalent of my father yelling, "Don't make me come down there." Okay. But human evil persisted. We kept making bad choices and compounding them with interest, until it looked like the whole human race was going to hell on wheels. This is when God had to adopt Plan B. He had to come down here and set things right personally, because as the saying goes, and I'm sure it's somewhere in Shakespeare, if you want to do something right, you have to do it yourself. If you want something done right, you've got to do it yourself. It's either in Shakespeare or the King James Bible. That's where practically all the great sayings come from. But why should God enter the world as a baby in a manger in a stable? Why not a splashier entrance, something to get more attention? The answer has everything to do with the nature of Jesus' saving work. How exactly did Jesus save mankind? Now here again, Swedenborg immensely deepens, and dare I say it, he civilizes, or better, divinizes, what was then and now Christian orthodoxy. The old church claims that mankind was in danger of hell because of the wrath of God, not because of our bad choices. Indeed, some Christians claim that we all deserve hell, no matter what our choices, for ultimately God is the only real chooser. Jesus, we are told, saved us from the wrathful Father by taking our punishment for us, by being a sacrifice to propitiate the wrath of the Father, by being a scapegoat who bore away the sins of all. Now, the great French poet and novelist, who was also a bit of a spirit seer himself, Victor Hugo, summed up this view quite brilliantly. He said, "The innocent God was tortured by the just God to please the loving God." Now, when you put it that way, there's something chilling, something horrible about this idea of redemption. The idea that somebody else can take your punishment for you, the idea of a whipping boy, is based on a very primitive notion of punishment. Punishment is just the expression, the satisfaction of sheer animal sadism. Okay? When an animal is injured, it lashes out in anger. It tries to inflict suffering. And it does not matter if the one who suffers is the party that originally wronged it. Okay? What matters is the sheer discharge of animal aggression. And for that, anything or anyone will do, particularly if they can feel pain. Justice really plays no role in it whatsoever. Now, if this is how Jesus saved the human race, by suffering the tortures that God had in mind for us, then really a newborn baby is the perfect form. For we do know that the ancient Jews and their neighbors, the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and the Moabites, did indeed practice infant sacrifice to propitiate angry gods. So if we accept the idea that the suffering of Jesus in our place is what saves us, then what we really need is an explanation for why he had to grow up at all and become a teacher of righteousness and the founder of a church. For none of that really would be necessary on the old church's orthodox model. Parenthetically, did anyone here see Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ? Does anyone remember the controversy around it? It's okay to raise your hand in church. Yeah. Well, I saw the movie, and I thought the style was a bit too Hollywood for my taste. But beyond that, what bothered me about it bothered me for reasons that were entirely unrelated to the Jewish campaign against it. What bothered me is that the movie focused almost entirely on the torture and execution of Jesus. But what did it say about his teachings? Well, nothing that I can recall. We learned more about Jesus as a carpenter than Jesus as a teacher. And that is because, bless him, Mel Gibson believes that it is the suffering, passion means suffering, of the Christ that saves us. What saves us is the suffering, not the life, not the ministry, not the teachings, not everything that came before that terrible day on Golgotha. Now, according to Swedenborg, this is a quote, the reason Jehovah God came into the world as a divine truth was so that he could effect redemption. And what does redemption mean? It means the conquest of the hells, the ordering of the heavens, and the establishment of a church. Now, all of these involve the transformation of human character and behavior. It sounds very grand to conquer the hells and reorganize the heavens. Why does God have to come into this world to do that? Well, the answer is that Swedenborg believes that all of us are always already creating a little hell or a little heaven for ourselves right now in this life. We have dual citizenship in this world and the spiritual world. And the choices that we make in this life are assigning us a place in that world. And at the point when we pass into the spiritual world, our eyes will be opened, and we will see the little heaven or the little hell that we have created for ourselves. So to conquer the hells and reorder the heavens means that God had to come into this world and change our perceptions, our priorities, our loves, our characters. And he had to do it in a way that preserved our freedom. And that's the necessity of the ministry of Jesus. Now, God could have entered the world in any form he wanted. He can do anything. He could have come as a fire-breathing dragon. He could have come as a cute little talking pig. Okay. But on Swedenborg's view, given that God's goal was the salvation of mankind in a way consistent with our freedom, he had to come as a human being. Swedenborg says, God could not redeem mankind, that is, rescue people from hell and damnation, except by taking upon himself human form. He couldn't just zap us into being good. He couldn't intimidate us or beguile us. He had to persuade us as rational and free beings. And persuasion is not just a matter of having a great argument. Okay? That's a very small part of persuasion. A much greater part of persuasion is speaking eloquently and also setting a personal example and establishing a personal rapport between
yourself in whatever format manifestation feels right. We do intend to do a full retro, as I said in my note. It is going to take some time. And then the other thing, just to
Jack Dorsey of Twitter.
Out a little bit, we are focused on one account right now, but this is going to be much bigger than just one account, and it's going to go on for much longer than just this day, this week, the next few weeks. It's going to go on beyond the inauguration. We have to expect that. We have to be ready for that. So the focus is certainly on this account and how it ties to real-world violence, but also we need to think much longer term around how these dynamics play out over time. I don't believe this is going away anytime soon, and the moves that we're making today around QAnon, for instance, is one such example of a much broader approach that we should be looking at and going deeper on. So the team has a lot of work and a lot of focus on this particular issue, but we also need to give them the space and the support to focus on the much bigger picture, because it is not going away. The U.S. is extremely divided. Our platform is showing that every single day, and our role is to protect the integrity of that conversation and do what we can to make sure that no one is being harmed based off that. And that is the focus, and that is the color we want to provide.
There you have it. Jack Dorsey, CEO of Twitter, recorded by one of his own employees, an insider whistleblower at Twitter, recorded saying this is going to be much bigger than just one account, revealing some censorship. You can see our motto at Veritas, our organization protected by an army of citizen patriots. We've had over a dozen people reach out to us this week with video, evidence inside Twitter. Stay tuned. They may be private companies, but they have more power than all three branches of government. Veritas tips at Pro.
Okay, there's nothing particularly shocking there that after a riot such as what happened last week on Capitol Hill, yeah, you can only expect continued censorship. Okay, Scottsdale prosecutor says far-right streamer Tim Baked Alaska Gionet violated release conditions by traveling to Capitol riot. When far-right social media personality Tim Baked Alaska was arrested in December in Scottsdale on suspicion of assault, disorderly conduct, and criminal trespass, a condition of his release was that he stay in Arizona. Now, Scottsdale prosecutors are seeking to revoke his release after he live-streamed last week from Washington, D.C., where he's seen interviewing random people on the street the night before the U.S. Capitol riot. Next day, he live-streamed from inside the historic building as thousands of people overran Capitol Hill and drove lawmakers into hiding. So I don't think the judge will be very happy. Baked Alaska is known, he's 33 years of age. He's known for his extreme, over-the-top internet stunts. He showed up without a mask in October inside a Flagstaff business and live stream reactions. His antics have increasingly led to him being banned from social media platforms. His live streaming last week from the nation's capital brought him a fresh round of publicity, including a critical account in the New York Times by a former co-worker at BuzzFeed. The Times column described him as the story of a man being rewarded for being a violent white nationalist, getting the attention and affirmation that he's apparently desperate for. His name does not appear among those who have been arrested or indicted on criminal charges related to the Capitol riot. Multiple law enforcement agencies are conducting a sprawling investigation into those who participated in the violence. 5 people died as a result of the rampage, including a Capitol police officer. Nearly 100 people nationwide have been arrested on charges that include violent entry and disorderly conduct. Apparently, hundreds will ultimately face charges. The FBI is using live streams, including those by Baked Alaska, to track down Capitol rioters. In one live stream the night before the riot, he begins his broadcast by yelling, "We're in Washington, D.C., boys. I just got here." He then wanders maskless down the street in a baseball cap, interviewing and confronting people along the way. So what would be a bigger moral sin, to walk down the street maskless or pantless? One of the men he interviews says he's from Queen Creek, Arizona. Talks about plans to go inside the U.S. Capitol. The man can be heard saying, "I don't even like to say it because I'll be arrested. I'll say it. We need to go into the Capitol." Okay, I know what you want. You want to get back to the lecture on German 19th century theology.
Very similar to some of the objections we saw in Ethan Allen the other day. Mars continues. If then we judge by these rules and commence an investigation of those Old Testament prophecies which have been applied to the New Testament, we shall find them to be worthless and false. Those examples, which are most clearly expressed, never came to pass. For example, that the Messiah should sit upon the seat of David on Mount Zion and reign from one sea to another, even unto the end of the world, and all besides that was prophesied of the deliverer of Israel. Old Testament prophecy understood literally didn't happen, therefore it's worthless as prophecy. Other prophecies are merely adapted through quibbles and in reality refer to quite other things. He's given a couple of examples. Later on, I will show that not a single sentence from the Old Testament applied by Matthew and others to the history of Jesus was written in the sense ascribed to it. Hold on to that thought that Reimarus is giving us there, that not a single sentence of the New Testament applies to the Old in a way that the Old meant it. You'll see this again as we're coming forward to look at the work of the establishment skeptics who wrote essays and reviews, and yet again in the work of the Dutch critic Kuenen, who is working in broadly parallel lines with the Tübingen school and takes Old Testament prophecy as his focus. Now, these kinds of objections had been addressed in the literature already, and Reimarus makes not the faintest attempt to engage with the responses given by people like Chandler or Bishop Kidder or other writers on Old Testament prophecy of time past. That doesn't mean he had not read them, but what he is doing here is not arguing for his position. He is simply stating his position. For his arguments, we are at a loss. We don't really have, except for a couple of examples where he simply brushes aside the idea that these kinds of things can be properly interpreted. We don't really have the details of his arguments about any given passage. Next figure that we have to come to is Heinrich Paulus, the German theologian, taught at a succession of universities, finally at Heidelberg. He was the one who hired Hegel in 1816, and Paulus's work influenced Hegel's theology. Paulus is an example of what we would call the rationalist movement. This is the movement of those who attempted to read through the New Testament and interpret it as literally taking place, except where the miracles occur, and those are just honest mistakes. So, for example, in the feeding of the 5,000, perhaps Jesus preaching suppressed people's hunger. That and a few bag lunches shared around a little bit could give rise to the miracle story. Jesus walking on water. Well, maybe he was walking on the shore. The Sea of Galilee is not that big after all, and some people saw him walking by the shore. That would explain why they thought he was walking on the water, and so on. This kind of explanation became very popular for a brief time around the year 1800 and is a topic of merciless criticism by Strauss. He wants to go much further. He says this is silly, that's not what they meant. You can't really sincerely believe that honest men with working senses could be mistaken over and over again in these ways. No, it's all or nothing. We have to take this either as totally mythical or allow its literal truth, and we're not going to do that. So Paulus had several followers, and they are known collectively as the German rationalists. So that word rationalist has a very special meaning here. It does not mean people who believe that there's synthetic a priori knowledge. It's not a term in the Kantian tradition. It does not mean what it might mean later, which is full-blown skeptics. These guys actually thought of themselves as defending Christianity, but they pretty much explained away the supernatural aspect of it. Next person we want to look at is Friedrich Schleiermacher. Schleiermacher was a theologian, philosopher, a biblical scholar. He's often called the father of modern liberal theology, and his reputation for that rests in no small part on one book that he wrote in 1799 and then had several editions of this come out later in his life, On Religion, Speeches or Discourses to Its Cultured Despisers. Schleiermacher is concerned to save the essence of Christianity as you would want to save the kernel of wheat and discard the husk. So what's the kernel and what's the husk? Here's how he puts it. Religion.
Okay, that may be a little bit too racy, so I'm not sure you're prepared for that. But back to Wilhelm de Witt, 19th century German Protestant theologian and Bible scholar. He argued that the Christian doctrine of atonement, the view that Christ bore the guilt of human sin to fulfill the demands of Old Testament law, arose only after Christ's death. The atonement cannot be proved based on Jesus' statements. His death is only raised to such importance by the apostles, so that a historical Jesus suffered and died a blameless death. De Witt accepts that Jesus' death should be understood in aesthetic terms. Yeah, people would be willing to sacrifice their lives for a Christianity understood in aesthetic terms. So he invokes his aesthetic subcategory of resignation, that Christ's death was a beautiful example of virtue and submission to the will of God. And according to this liberal Protestant perspective, the eternal ideas embedded in the Gospels, not the temporal historical details of the story, were what were essential for the religious outlook. And with regard to the resurrection, De Witt writes that a miraculous element remains even if we do not believe that Christ actually lived again. That when one envisions the crucified Christ, this should not call a historical event or a dogma to mind. Rather, one should see an image of humanity purified by self-sacrifice. So the mythical worldview of the gospel narrators, their traditions, religious sensibilities, and expectations rendered genuine historical knowledge impossible. According to David Friedrich Strauss, the father of Unbelief, does not deny that historical events may lie behind the myths, But he says the narratives themselves in the synoptic gospels are not to be regarded as historical. Thus, Christianity cannot be traced to one individual. This should affect an internal liberation from history and allow Christianity to be constructed on purely philosophical grounds. So it sounds a lot like Maimonides constructing Judaism on philosophical grounds. Contemporaries reacted to David Strauss's book with wholesale condemnation. One said the book should be thrown like a firebomb into the tinder dry pietistic forests of Wittenberg. Not only pietists were alarmed, Strauss's book triggered critical responses from practically every theological outlook in Europe, from the Orthodox camp, the Rationalist camp, and the Hegelian camp. The book cost David Strauss his teaching position at the University of Tübingen. In 1839, it cost him another one in Zurich. DeWitt was unique among established biblical critics in his positive reaction to Strauss. DeWitt believed that the question of the divinity of Jesus was independent of historical criticism, that the divine could be grasped only subjectively, and that it was symbolic. And so he thought that this symbolic understanding of Christianity could insulate it from historical criticism. Theologians of various stripes attributed a certain inevitability to the appearance of David Strauss's The Life of Jesus in 1835. Hans Frey argued that Strauss represented the decisive climax of 18th century criticism by his reduction of the meaning of the Gospels to a historical understanding of its author's intentions. So that's what tends to happen with a historicist perspective. We start reading a text not so much for the plain meaning of the text, but to try to understand the intentions of the authors of the text. William Neal says David Friedrich Strauss was the figure who finally cut the Gordian knot between rationalism and orthodoxy and changed the entire direction of New Testament study for the rest of the 19th century. Friedrich Wiesche claimed in 1838 that the publication of The Life of Jesus made David Strauss one of those representative men who crystallized the collective consciousness of their generation. So I've often been written about in the news media, but it's not usually, wow, there's this really interesting guy, Luke Ford. It's usually, here is a guy who represents a certain trend about what's happening in society or in Los Angeles or on the internet or with blogging. So people become more interesting to academic and journalistic study when they can be seen as representative, all right? People, generally speaking, don't care that much about you, right? People overwhelmingly think about themselves. To the extent that people think about you, it's when you represent something to them. So you've got to represent something greater than yourself to generate much interest. So when he was dismissed from the Tübingen Seminary, David Strauss stated that the views expressed in his book were not merely the notions of one individual, but the conclusions of a whole direction of theological and historical scholarship. Abandoned by his peers, so this reminds me of all the times that it felt like I lost every friend I had in the world when I said something publicly that was forbidden. David Strauss complained of being vexed by my isolated position and annoyed with my friends that now, when the situation becomes serious, they suddenly leave the cart standing, which for so long we all pulled together. Yeah, so I remember in high school, I was publishing an article on preferential treatment given to football players by various teachers. And I'd worked with friends on the article, but when the article came out, all my friends abandoned me, and I was left standing alone with my editor, Eric Scholsky, who went on to get a PhD in political science from Berkeley. He was a spokesman for, I think, John Doolittle, a Republican congressman from the Sacramento area. Now Eric is a political scientist at Brigham Young University. He stood by me. He defended me. So the controversies that ensued over David Strauss's The Life of Jesus were of major proportions. Theological leaders throughout Germany engaged in a polemical warfare of a magnitude rivaling the period after the Reformation. So there was a theological dispute that was rivaled the intensity of, say, the 30 Years' War. The 1830s were perhaps even more dramatic because Christianity itself, and not simply the question of which form of Christianity, was taken as one of the main points under discussion, and the conflict was by no means confined to elite circles. Educated lay people and average parishioners became engaged in the knowledge versus faith dilemma of their time. Not only in the theological seminaries did the book produce a great sensation and continuing controversy over the problems which it raised, but also at every church, in every town, in an age when the church still formed the central position in the lives of the majority of the population.
Is the outcome neither of the fear of death nor of the fear of God. It answers a deep need in man. It is neither a metaphysic nor a morality, but above all and essentially an intuition and a feeling. Not a morality, a feeling. Think here of Matthew Arnold talking about the eternal, not ourselves, that makes for righteousness. Dogmas, teachings, are not, properly speaking, part of religion. Rather, it is that they are derived from it. Religion is the miracle of direct relationship with the infinite, and dogmas are the reflection of this miracle. Similarly, belief in God and in personal immortality are not necessarily a part of religion. One can't conceive of a religion without God, and it would be pure contemplation of the universe. The desire for personal immortality seems rather to show a lack of religion, since religion assumes a desire to lose oneself in the infinite, rather than to preserve one's own finite self. Those of you who are looking forward to the section on transcendental skepticism in Ralph Waldo Emerson might want to make special note of this passage from Schleiermacher, because I think this expresses quite well something that Emerson himself is going to be displaying in his Divinity School address in the 1830s. And finally, with that background, we come to our man for the hour, David Friedrich Strauss, died in 1874. German theologian, he caused a scandal as a young man by the publication of his Life of Jesus. You'll notice that he's about 27 years old when that comes out. That went through 4 editions in his lifetime, was translated into English by Marianne Evans. Strauss was debarred from several teaching positions. He had an unhappy personal life. He married a woman who had been a famous actress, but the marriage was not a happy one, and they separated and divorced. He continued to write polemical pieces and a new Life of Jesus for the German people, not directed at scholars, but directed at the common man, and ended his days avowing very directly that Christianity was false, and that the choice was between Christianity and a special form of atheism which had finally been given its true shape in the teaching of Charles Darwin. To get the timeline here, remember that Darwin published his Origin of Species in 1859. So...
Okay, Michael Tracy tweets about the House's impeachment. Okay, one of the articles of impeachment to demonstrate Donald Trump's incitement of the mob is an unremarkable line that Trump could have used in about 1,000 different contexts over the past 5 years. A line, if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore. So that's used in the House of Representatives impeachment of the president. Trump also said in the speech, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. Said for months that Trump's fraud theories were garbage, but so is this newly invented incitement doctrine. Of course, not a word from the ACLU about the speech-chilling ramifications of this impeachment, nor would you expect any given their full transformation into an anti-Trump left liberal advocacy organization. Still 6 days left to squeeze out for all it's worth. The more I think about it, the more absurd and hilarious it is that this quote from Trump is the one finally determined to have been beyond the pale. There have been days when he's tweeted about 25 crazier things. And Black Lives Matter activist has been arrested in connection with the Capitol Hill riots. So let me post that. It's on Post Millennial. So Black Lives Matter activist John Sullivan, 25, was caught in a photograph of the Capitol Hill riot January 6th, was arrested Thursday for participating knowingly and willfully in illegal conduct when he breached the Capitol, according to a sworn affidavit. So the news media was portraying this guy as some kind of hero, that he was a citizen journalist. That's all he was. But evidence shows him agitating the crowd and inciting violence. Black Lives Matter threatening to rip the president out of the White House. Come on, man.
What's going on? What's going on, everybody? My name's John Sullivan. I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. My group is Insurgents USA. We fucking about to burn this shit down. Fuck this shit. Anybody out here seeing that white militia guy shoot three kids? Yeah. Fuck that guy. And I will tell you this shit is in Utah, a whole bunch of white militia came out there, formed against our group. We out there strapped. We out there ready to burn that shit down. We out there to defend our fucking self. We got to defend ourselves now too. We do. Because power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Damn right. We got fucking Rick Trump out of that office right over there. Fucking pull him out that shit. Nah, we ain't about fucking waiting until the next election. We about to go get that motherfucker. I ain't about that shit. Because you know what time it is? I want y'all to be after me. It's time for a revolution. It's time for a revolution. It's time for a revolution. Thank you guys. I appreciate y'all. Be safe. Be blessed.
Okay, let's get back to 19th century Protestant theology.
Smack in the middle of his life, Strauss encountered Darwin, and when he did, he might have said in the words that Richard Dawkins has subsequently used, that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. But at the period at which he wrote his Life of Jesus, and for the time of several of its republications, he was not an atheist, he was a pantheist, along the lines of Spinoza. And he speaks glowingly about the truth of Christian religion, which, however, like Schleiermacher, he says is not connected with any actual doctrines. Strauss approaches the New Testament text in his Life of Jesus with two principles in hand, and we can find these in the edition of Strauss that I was having you do for reading this weekend on pages 87 and 88, as well as in some other places. That an account is not historical, that the matter related could not have taken place in the manner described, is evident, first, when the narration is irreconcilable with the known and universal laws which govern the course of events. Strauss does not name David Hume here in this book, but in his new Life of Jesus, he does explicitly draw attention to both Spinoza and Hume and say, this is why we cannot take seriously any account that tells us that there has been a violation of the universal laws which govern the course of events. Why are
So Wissenschaft is the German word for science. And so science in this context simply is supposed to mean the pursuit of truth wherever it leads. So for particularly Protestant theologians and philosophers and Bible scholars, Wissenschaft, science, became the new measure for the question of meaning in life and happiness. The path of Wissenschaft, the pursuit of truth, became the path to truth, freedom, and humanity. The ever-expanding scope of truth and the accumulation of knowledge was raised to the highest moral duty, became one of the highest forms of human existence. It became even something holy, a piece of immortality. It became the dominating passion among these Protestant academics. It disciplined the rest of one's life aesthetically. Scholars in Germany were convinced that the knowledge of their predecessors was superficial at best, and that bold acts of intelligence and will by the single scholar could uncover the profound secrets of the human world and the universe beyond. So these scholars were largely unconcerned with what scholars today would assume to be the socially dependent character of knowledge. These 19th century German scholars, this is why I love 19th century scholarship, is that there is a belief in empirical, verifiable, transcendent truth. They saw themselves in the 19th century pursuing truth, pure and simple. Their goal was to depict the world and God's relation to the world in terms of how things really are, even if this means engaging in a rarefied scholarly idiom and disturbing the theologically timid. So mid-19th century debates are viewed as an autonomous realm of discourse, a best approach with an eye toward shedding light on the underlying intellectual presuppositions of the time. So in other words, when you look at these debates, don't look at them primarily in terms of what they are ostensibly talking about. Look at them in terms of what are the underlying intellectual presuppositions. What are they taking for granted? So often when you hear people, the most important things that one can get from listening to people are what they are not saying. What are the truths that they take for granted? Now, what's the correspondence theory of truth? Press 1 if you hold with the correspondence theory of truth. It's probably the oldest theory of truth. It is its most common understanding to Aristotle, that truth consists of correspondence between the world of thought and the world of things, or between the world of mind and the world of matter. So nature is out there. It's independent of the mind that attempts to know it. To establish the truth of an assertion about the world, one must show a correlation between the rational categories about which the assertion is made, and the apprehension of nature in experience. And this must be done completely apart from one's own prejudices and beliefs. The scientist does not give in to the belief that he has created the law. He feels in his innermost being that the facts imposed it on him. So the correspondence theory of truth requires one to assume that that which the mind conceives about the world is ontologically real. Ontology is the study of final things, final causes. It is a theory for the realist. It allows one to speak of a reality apart from the theory and the theorist conceptualizing it. It makes a strong metaphysical claim. It states that truth is nothing less than establishing what actually exists. Accurate knowledge of nature is simultaneously the truth of nature. So Jacob Burckhardt, his father was the leading cleric in Basel, Switzerland. He comes to university intending to study to become Christian minister, and then he loses his faith when he undergoes historical investigation. And so he completely drops his Christianity and becomes a scholar of cultural history. And he says, from our point of view, meaning from a historical point of view, Christianity has entered the realm of purely human periods of history. So he does not look Christianity anymore through a transcendent lens. Jacob Burckhardt was not a big fan of deficit spending. He said the state incurs debts for politics, war, and other higher causes and progress. The assumption is that the future will honor this relation in perpetuity. The state has learned from the merchants and industrialists how to exploit credit. It defies the nation ever to let it go into bankruptcy. Alongside all swindlers, the state now stands there as swindler in chief. Now, you can see certain Christian underpinnings to Jacob Burckhardt's thought, namely a deep-seated historical and cultural pessimism inherited from the Christian idea of original sin. So his cultural pessimism made him an anomaly among 19th century historians and philosophers of history. The general philosophy outlook of the 19th century was that we are embarked towards ever-increasing progress. So this is a century when progressive evolutionary models of history reigned supreme. Jacob Burckhardt, however, maintained that progress is intrinsically ridiculous, that greed and desire know no limits, that one will always encounter a dissatisfied humanity. Regarding Hegelian philosophy, Burckhardt warned his students that this bold assumption of a world plan leads to fallacies because it starts out from false premises. He also doubted Rousseau's moral dream and the assumption that all men are by nature good. So Jacob Burckhardt was very much out of place in his own century, but has a home in our century. He has come to represent the foundations of modern political historiography. His lack of system, his characteristic irony, his zeal for knowledge, but willingness to voice epistemological shortcomings. Epistemology is the science of how do we know what we know. His preference for culture over politics has earned him a saintly status in the eyes of historians, philosophers since the mid-20th century. His moderate postmodernism has been celebrated, unlike the radical postmodernism of Nietzsche, that Burckhardt should be used as a historical mirror in which we can see what is wrong with our time. All agree that Burckhardt somehow transcended his time, became a precociously critical of modernity. And what brought this about? It was the encounter with Wilhelm de Witt, the historian, Bible scholar, and theologian. Profoundly disturbed the young Burckhardt about age 18, forcing him to confront his situation. He could neither return to Orthodox Christianity nor accept de Witt's liberal Protestantism. So he sought to escape his predicament, not by choosing between them, but turning instead to historical studies as his new calling. Yet his theological unrest never completely dissipated. He retained an inclination to think in categories and language derived from the biblical cultural heritage of pious Basel, Switzerland. His vow to remain an honest heretic even suggests a residual allegiance to his childhood faith, a faith no longer held, but one whose deep-seated presence revealed itself in Burckhardt's refusal to allow any compensatory teleological vision of history to fill its absence. The ruins of his Christian faith ramifying throughout his subsequent career, furnished him with an incredulity toward the optimizing tendencies and the epistemological confidence characteristic of, say, the Hegelian, the Marxian, the Comtean, or the Rankian approaches to history. So he had an incredulity towards the very foundations of modern historical thinking. Just as Christianity cannot be reduced to its eschatology, so Christianity believes that at the end of the time, things will get much, much better. So that's kind of an optimistic outlook. But there's an equally important aspect of Christianity, particularly in Orthodox Protestantism, that is its thorough pessimism concerning the things of this world. So Christianity believes in original sin. Judaism does not believe in original sin, but Judaism believes in human weakness and frailty, and that everybody has an inclination to do evil as well as an inclination to do good. Judaism is more optimistic about human potential in this world than Christianity. A particular understanding of history informed Jacob Burckhardt's new calling. His turn to history reflects a post-story historical appreciation of the individual rather than an idealistic a priori philosophical preoccupation with the general or the speculative. So posteriori means looking backwards, a priori means looking beforehand.
Are we so stuck on those laws? Well, long, patient scientific work has disclosed to us these laws. We finally stand, had he been a Darwinist at this time, he would have said at the pinnacle of evolution, we finally have come to the realization that the universe is causally closed. Determinism is true, and
my friend Ricardo comes through for me once again. How much do I owe this guy? Press 77 in the chat if I owe Ricardo 77 virgins in the world to come. So he has a great question. What was Desmond Ford's perspective on these issues? So a problem is that I started to tune out my dad because I had to listen to thousands of hours of his sermons and teachings. So I started to tune him out. But my father had a very pessimistic view of human nature. My father cared not a cracker for this world. My father did not believe that necessarily every word of the New Testament was divine, but my father did believe in the divinity of Jesus. He believed that the Bible was perfect for its purpose. So he didn't believe that the Bible was necessarily perfect in every respect. He believes that it was perfect for its purpose, which was to humble people and to try to bring them to Christ. My father believed that the 19th century notion of inevitable progress was misguided. Father was very much an evangelical Christian. Desmond Ford, born February 2nd, 1929, died March 11, 29. He was a controversial figure, dismissed from ministry in the Adventist Church in 1980. He since worked through the non-denominational evangelical ministry Good News Unlimited. He defended a conservative view of Scripture. So a conservative view is more likely to believe that there are real historical events referenced in Scripture. The more liberal view is that there are few, if any, historicity to the Scriptures. My father believed in a vegetarian lifestyle. What are his other beliefs? My father believed that victory over sin was provided at the cross. The victory over the power of sin is the work of a lifetime, and victory over the presence of sin occurs at the return of Jesus. He disagreed strongly with the belief of eschatological perfectionism, that the final generation of believers must achieve a state of complete sinlessness or Christ-likeness. My father, believed very strongly in original sin. And hang on a sec.
Yourself and the person you're trying to teach. Okay. Jesus had to be a teacher in both words and deeds. And for us to truly relate to him and truly learn from him, he had to have led a full human life. He had to be born a baby. He had to be raised in the bosom of a family. He had to have playmates and friends. He had to go to school. He had to receive religious instruction.
I just want to greet everyone and say hello and welcome to Christian Scholars Forum, aka CSF. Scholars are those who have an aptitude for study and have developed an expertise in a particular area of study. On this forum, we seek to understand the depth of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the purpose of this forum is to encourage every mind to seek wisdom which comes freely from above, to educate through scholarly biblical research, and to enhance and expand the mind with knowledge, both old and new. We want to address people from every walk of life, to come to a oneness and unity of faith in Christ Jesus. So today we ask you to challenge yourself with the things you're about to hear. Be objective and open and be fearless to question what you believe and see if you are truly walking in faith and in the truth. Currently, we're doing a series entitled 1844 Revisited, in which we'll be covering a host of topics and unveiling paradigms of truth through a series of presentations, interviews, and panel discussions. Today, we're excited to interview with Jill Ford. She's the wife of the late Desmond Ford, who sadly, but with peace, fell asleep in the Lord on March 11, 2019, leaving behind his precious wife and 3 adult children and grandchildren. Dr. Desmond Ford was a well-known, respected theologian throughout Christendom, who in the 60s and 70s became a prominent preacher of the gospel of righteousness by faith. He was the head of the Department of Theology at Avondale College in Australia for 15 years, and just this past August celebrated 40 years since Glacier View. And today is very special as we are celebrating with Jill today in this interview. And so Jill today will share with us their journey to Glacier View, how it all began, what happened, and how it all ended. This is part of a 2-part series. This is part 1 of the truth about Desmond Ford and Glacier View. And now at this time, I would like to introduce Arthur Branner, who will have a formal introduction in a little while. But right now, we just want to introduce him as he gives us the opening prayer. Let us bow our heads in prayer.
Good evening, and we'd like to thank all of our viewers, those who have tuned in from all over the world. And I pray that this is a rich blessing for each and every one who has tuned in. May your hearts be open. Let us bow our heads in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this occasion that allows us to coalesce together in this electronic room. We pray, Heavenly Father, that your Holy Spirit will be here to guide us. We ask, oh God, that you will give us understanding in accordance to your divine will. We pray that you would be with those of the presenters as they present. May you use them in a mighty way. May the power of heaven, the anointing of the Holy Ghost, fall afresh upon them. We thank you for your forgiveness. We ask, oh God, that you would continue to bless each hearer throughout the night, and may their ears hear what is needed in order to encourage, to inspire, and yet even challenge their understanding. We thank you and we praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you, Pastor Arthur. And now at this time, we're going to introduce our panel who will be on this discussion with us. And first of all, we'd like to start with our president here of CSF, Dr. Clinton Baldwin. Dr. Clinton Baldwin is a minister of the gospel. He is the president of Christian Scholars Forum. Dr. Baldwin earned a PhD in religion from Andrews University in Berrien Springs, Michigan, with special emphasis in New Testament textual criticism. Dr. Baldwin has taught several undergrad and graduate courses in several institutions. Currently, he serves as chair for the theology department at the Caribbean Graduate School of Theology in Kingston, Jamaica. Additionally, he's the founder and president of Dikaioma Ministries International. Our next panel member is Pastor Arthur Branner. He also is a minister of the gospel and graduate of the Theological Seminary at Andrews University in Michigan, Berrien Springs, Michigan. He is currently writing his PhD dissertation on studies in Christian counseling with emphasis on the formation of mental disease caused by unforgiveness. He is a former captain in the U.S. Army National Guard. He is currently the president of Science of Salvation Family Life Ministries and also vice president of CSF. Next is our host there is Pastor Brian Reed. He also is a minister of the gospel. He is a graduate of Andrews University Theological Seminary. He also holds a degree in psychology and also in management. He's the executive secretary for CSF. He is also the founder, president, and senior pastor of Eden Home Ministries. He's a gifted family life counselor and teacher who specializes in addictions and anger management. Pastor Brian is an international evangelist and seminar presenter. John Rosier, a wonderful and interesting man, hails from England. He is a minister of the gospel. He is a theologian and graduate of Newbold College in England. He lives in Leamington Spa in England and is a college professor and research historian. He is a speaker, preacher, a prolific writer, and the founder of Opinion Christian Forum. Currently, he sits on the board of CSF as our chief historian archivist. And now I'd like to introduce our guest speaker and very special person who we will be sharing and talking with in the next couple of hours. And our special guest tonight is Gillian Ford, fondly known as Jill. Jill is a writer, editor, linguist, and health director and educator. Jill, we all just want to embrace you right now and put our arms around you, all the team here of CSF, and we want to thank you so much for taking this time to spend with us in this interview. It is 40 years since Glacier View, and I was quite a bit of a rebellious teenager at the time, as I remember myself. And I remember hearing your husband's name even in my home and in my church. And we are so grateful that you are here to share your heart with us. So welcome, Jill Ford, once again. Again, I just want to say here that John Rosier, we just want to mention his name again. He will be assisting Jill in this interview and will be disclosing much of the theology or the theological history for this discussion. So Jill and John will be together on this interview as the panel works with them and get to understand more and more about what happened at Glacier View. Let me just share a quick little snippet about myself. I'm also a minister of the gospel, and I enjoy sharing and teaching the gospel to others. I, too, am a graduate of Andrews University and California Coast University, and I earned a PhD in research psychology, specializing in cognitive neuropsychology, neuroscience, and emotional intelligence. I've worked as a college professor, counselor, and therapist, and currently I'm a consultant in the area of mental and spiritual and emotional health. I'm also the vice president for Science of Salvation, standing with my husband, and currently the director of public relations and marketing for CSF, Christian Scholars Forum. Now, before we get started, I'm sure you observed the fact that this forum has a passion for healthy cognitive development. While we want to expand your thinking, we are still very much aware of the effects of cognitive dissonance. As a result, I'm going to ask Pastor Brian, one of our counselors on the team, to explain exactly what that is. Pastor Brian?
Unmute yourself, Pastor.
Come on, guys, get it together.
All right, Pastor Brian.
Come on, I want to hear about cognitive dissonance.
And if you come to this forum, as you come to this forum, if you are the type of person interested in learning and learning new truth, then you're the wrong place. But this is the place. So if you're interested in learning and growing, this is the place for you. Christian Scholars Forum is new on the scene, and my God, we are going places. Just you watch. Pastor Brian, please, coming up step.
Thank you, Dr. Baldwin. I am just going to, as we get into our presentation this evening, just to share something about the power of cognitive dissonance. It's a very powerful thing as to how the mind works and how it seeks to adapt and to deal with anything that appears to be a disconnect in the psyche. So I just want to share that with you as we get into this presentation. As Dr. Baldwin says, you will hear stuff that you've not heard before. That you remember the royal law, to love your neighbor as yourself. Minimize the attacks and the disparaging or hateful statements. And let us all remember that we are children of God. Thank you.
So I talked earlier about how I tended to tune my father out because I heard so many of his sermons. That's not a problem that's unique to me. The better we know someone, the longer we know someone, the more familiar we are with someone, the less likely we are to listen to them. So it's actually a pretty big problem. With people that we know well, with people with whom we are familiar, we do not tend to pay nearly as much attention to what they say as we do to complete strangers.
Thank you so much, Pastor Brian. That was very well said, and I just pray that we will truly take that to heart and search ourselves. And at this time, we want to get into our panel discussion now. And Jill, again, welcome. And I will begin with the questions. And I have 3 questions for you today, Jill. And I'm going to try to merge them so you can sort of answer them in the next 10 to 15 minutes or so. So the first question is, who was Desmond Ford? And tell us about the early years, his connection with Adventism, and then end off with how you both met and your part in the life of ministry together. Thank you, Jill.
Thank you, Esme. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you wonderfully.
Oh, great. I got up at 1:30 this morning to be ready, and I'm sorry that I couldn't get through on Zoom. Anyway, I won't go into that. It was very okay. Desmond.
Jill, can you put your video on, please?
Start video. I saw that. I hope.
All right, it's coming. It's coming. There you go. There you go.
Yes, I'm hot and bothered.
Okay, there you are.
Des was born in 1929, the year of the Depression. So he lived until he was 90. His parents were Wilfred Allen Ford and Emma Lillian Simpson. Now, I have to read up on his early years. I know some of it, but of course
So my stepmom here, she's very smart. She's very funny. She's quite well educated. She played a very significant role in my father's career. She helped him with his second PhD thesis because of her own knowledge of French and German. And I think she recently, in the last few years, did a master's degree in history. And she may well go on to do a PhD, even though she's in her 70s. So she still loves learning.
I was born in 1944. When Des was becoming an Adventist, so I wasn't around in these years. His family were not Adventists, and there were really no relatives.
So one way that you can tell your relative level of intelligence is how quickly you pick up on developments on a TV show or the plot in a movie or a novel. So my stepmom, Jill, here, she would always catch developments in movies, TV shows, novels that we were reading. She would always catch them ahead of me. Why was she always catching these things ahead of me? Because she is substantially more intelligent than I am.
who were Adventists, except his paternal grandfather's brother was an Adventist. And he had two sons or grandsons who were ministers. And so they're the only relatives that Des had in the Adventist church. His father was a post office telegrapher, and during the war, he went to Canberra and he worked in the Prime Minister's office as a Morse code operator, back in those days when they used Morse code. His maternal grandmother, his mother was Emma Lillian Simpson, and her grandfather was the editor of the Townsville Bulletin, which is a place up in North Queensland. So the bookishness came from his father, who was a great reader. He used to give Des a shilling for every book that he read, and his father had done the same to him. And on his mother's side, this editor who had quite a library.
And my father did the same for me. I believe he gave me $20 the first time I read the Bible all the way through. I think I would have been about age 9. So he would financially incentivize me to fall in love with reading books.
Which Des loved to read. Now, Des was a great reader from a very small child. And he read all sorts of stuff, a lot of fiction, but also...
So both my parents were substantially smarter than me. So I had the experience growing up with both my father and my stepmother, or at least a standard deviation, at least 15 IQ points sharper, faster. Like, smart people are faster. They pick things up faster. They're living more likely to live in the future than less intelligent ones such as myself. So pretty much every argument I ever had with my father and with my stepmother, I would lose, meaning intellectual argument, because they were just sharper, faster, smarter than me, and more educated, more learned, better read, more sophisticated.
So serious stuff. Luke, his son, was very much the same. As soon as he got to 5, you couldn't stop him reading. And they were just unusual readers. So Des was born 2nd of February in 1929. He was the second son. His brother was Val Hilton Ford, now deceased. He lived in the tropics in North Queensland. That meant he didn't wear shoes until he was a teenager, just wore a straw hat because of the sun and shorts.
So my dad's brother was an ideologue like my dad, only his ideology was atheistic communism. And he was also a bit of a gambler and a drinker. And he was a longshoreman, I think, for a while. And then he got on disability. I think spent most of his life on disability. My dad's brother, Val.
When his mother was pregnant with him, she was visited by a coal porter called Lindsay Rowland, not somebody that I know. And as his mother became interested in health, she didn't like to cook. She liked the idea of raw food. His father wasn't very interested in religion. When the coal porter started to talk about religious topics and introduced the Sabbath, the studies ended. But there was a relationship with the family. His mother was always sort of interested. His parents separated at age 9. His father went to Canberra, I told you, worked as a Morse code operator for the Prime Minister. And I won't go into too much detail, but a lady came to visit him, another coal porter, and her husband was the president of the conference in Queensland. And they bought Des a Bible, and he read that over the next few years. Anyway, he went to high school in Sydney, and his headmaster advised his mother to pull him out early, find him a job, because soldiers were coming back from World War II and there wouldn't be a job available. So he did not matriculate, and he began working as a trainee journalist and typesetter at Associated Newspapers. So his background was journalism, only for a brief time, but he was writing fiction, actually, quite hair-raising fiction about the war. He began buying books when he was 14, such books as Thomas Scott's Commentary, Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation by Uriah Smith, Ellen White's Messages to Young People. Most young people would not like that book. Des loved it and felt that it changed his life because he was a fictionalaholic, and it stopped him. He would never have got any academic work done had he not stopped reading fiction and other books. And he would visit secondhand bookstores. He went on a visit down to Melbourne, read a book by Reuben Torrey, so he was reading scholarly books from non-Adventist authors very young. And he bought Turton's Truth of Christianity, Charles Spurgeon, Christ's Glorious Achievements. He loves Spurgeon, and Spurgeon is probably responsible for Des's emphasis on the gospel. William Paley's Christian Evidences, and he bought a 5-commentary set of Thomas Vaughan's Introduction to the Critical Study and Knowledge of the Holy Scriptures in 5 volumes. And in this, he learned about the conditional element of prophecy and the double applications of Scripture. Then he heard Lawrence Maiden on the radio. He spoke for the Voice of Prophecy, and he completed a Bible study course. The person who came around thought that he would find a grown man and found this boy. Anyway, his mother and brother were opposed to Des becoming an Adventist, but he was baptized in 1946. Anyway, I won't go through any more than that. You wanted to know, you gave me 10 minutes. What was my role in Des's ministry? Okay, so I come on the picture I was born. Do you have a question, Esme?
Your mic is you're muted, Dr. Ez.
Oh.
You are muted.
She says well, she mute herself.
I'll just keep going. So I come into the picture because I became an Adventist when I was 18. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Dr. Ez.
She cannot unmute herself for some.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it now. Thank you. Go ahead, Jill.
Okay, so there's other interesting things in Des's background, but I did this too detailed. He was married before. How did I meet him?
Oh, yes, right there. He was married before, so that's a good
Married before, the mother of his 3 children. She died of cancer when she was actually the day.
I always had a hard time writing essays. That particular genre is not suited. I'm more kind of stream of consciousness. But my stepmother and my father were much better at the kind of organized, logical thinking that underpins essays. So I never have learned to pull off the essay. Not my strong point. But my stepmom's quite good at it.
After her 40th birthday. So she was very young, and this had terrible effect on the family. But anyway, I'll go back on my story. So I came into the church. I probably was baptized about 18 or 19 in New Zealand. And I'd never heard of Adventists in my life, except that my grandmother in England, because I came out from England when I was 16, my grandmother had given me a book by Uncle Arthur, a Jehovah's Witness version, because my grandmother was a Jehovah's Witness. And reading that book, there was a story about a little girl praying, and I looked up and saw God. That was my first experience with understanding that there was a God. So until I was about 12, I went along to Jehovah's Witness meetings, and then I gave it up. My sister left home, causing quite a storm as she went. And then we went over to England when we came from England, went to New Zealand. And I was working in a factory in Christchurch and found a job in northern New Zealand. And they asked me what sort of boarding I would like, and I boarded with an Adventist. And she invited me to go to church. I had some contact with Adventists in Christchurch. I went to a mission. I thought it was rubbish. So I left Christchurch. But God was after me to come into the church. So I went along to church. I had a very good minister, Eric Robinson, who was very progressive. He posed questions on doctrine. Man, we can talk about what that means later. But I didn't have to unlearn, when I went to Avondale, anything that I learned from Eric Robinson. He taught me the sinless nature of Christ. And I knew nothing about traditional Adventism. So I'm very different.
So great question in the chat. Did Desmond Ford ever listen to Dennis Prager and his commentary on the Bible and theology? And my father listened to hundreds of hours of Dennis Prager because starting 1988, I became really into Dennis Prager, and I eventually bought hundreds of hours of Dennis Prager's talks. My father particularly enjoyed Dennis Prager's commentary on the Bible. And so my father respected Dennis Prager for helping to bring me back to God, though, of course, my father, as a Christian theologian, was not thrilled with me converting to Judaism, but he certainly thought that Judaism was far better than being an atheist. So when I was really getting into Dennis Prager, and I was living with my parents from 1990 to 1993 in fairly isolated Northern California in Newcastle, so I had all these boxes of Prager tapes, and then I'd lend them to my dad, and we would very tentatively discuss them. My father corresponded extensively with Dennis Prager, or my father sent him a lot of letters, because my father was obviously concerned about my own direction. My father saw problems in Dennis Prager's theology, and I think Dennis Prager finally wrote him back saying, you've sent me so many letters, I simply don't have the time to respond, but I really like that one line that my father apparently gave him, a line that my father used in many of his teachings, that 50% of what I'm going to tell you is going to be theologically false. I just don't know which 50%. So yeah, my father listened to Dennis Prager. He saw some errors in Prager. He would occasionally very politely, gingerly mention where he thought that Dennis Prager was falling short, where Dennis Prager didn't get it. I was so sick at the time that I had my parents read to me Dennis Prager's book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism. So I'm lying in my sick bed. My parents are reading me this introductory text on Judaism, including the section where Dennis Prager unfavorably compares Christianity to Judaism and why Judaism is so superior. My poor parents are reading it aloud to me. And I remember my dad would wince at some of the Pragerisms. And my stepmom had a pretty sharp observation circa 1992. She said, someone should tell Dennis Prager that you are going to betray him like you do everyone else. So that was prescient. So yeah, my my parents knew how much I tended to extremes, how I tended to idealize and then devalue people. That one moment I had someone on a pedestal, and then the next minute in my mind I essentially put them in the trash heap. So yeah, my parents knew me pretty darn well. They knew me sometimes uncomfortably well. It was, a little harder for me to maintain my own delusions when they had, such a track record with my own history of frailty, hypocrisy, incompetence, malevolence, and attention seeking. So my father only made one attempt to try to dissuade me from converting to Judaism, just once. He said, well, you should read these books on of Christian apologetics before you convert to Judaism. And my attitude was, Dad, you assigned me, 50 books of Christian apologetics when I was a kid. I don't want to read another damn book of Christian apologetics. So when I finally passed the Beit Din in, I think, late 1992, came home, told my dad that I'd converted to Judaism, that I'd passed the Beit Din. He was sitting in the kitchen, I think, reading, I assume, Christian theology. He looked up from his book and he said, well, they're certainly not like the Seventh-day Adventists out there proselytizing, because he knew how difficult it had been for me to make it through a Jewish conversion process. So intermittently, every few years, he would send me books or tracts or papers trying to make the case for Christianity as against Judaism. But my parents also saw very quickly that I was not living up to Judaism in any way, shape, or form, that I willfully, wantonly disregarded many of the most basic teachings of Judaism in my pursuit of carnal pleasure.
Some of you who've grown up in the church, and it was very much part of your life. I was also taught a very practical view of Ellen White, not very much at all, but that she was a fine Christian woman. He talked about the funeral of her husband and her attitude. So I never was raised with all the problems that so many Adventists have with the writings of Ellen White. Anyway, the church where I was wanted me to go to Avondale, and that's how I met Des. And I had a very good job, and I was only going to go for a year and do subjects, but I thought I ought to be a Bible worker. And I was in the lines and standing behind a young ministerial student, and I said to him, I feel as though I ought to be a Bible worker. He was a very dramatic type, and he said to me, you cannot put your hand to the plough and turn back, go to the line and register. And I did, with much weeping. And because of that, I went into typing. I could only type about 30 letters a minute. So I got up to 60 words a minute. And I also went into Desmond Ford's Daniel and Revelation, basically off the street. So you can imagine what that was like. So by the end of the next year, there's a secretary suggested that I become the secretary, which I couldn't have done if I hadn't done typing. But anyway, I wrote an essay, and Des noticed me. I had no idea it was anything significant. But I wrote an essay on Antiochus Epiphanes and the apostolic principle, which stunned Des. But I was so he noted me, and I was appointed by witness.